I was on the freeway, and here comes somebody speeding, and all of a sudden he just swerves around my car. It's like he's right there, like a moment stop. And he has this horrible big grin, and he's missing all these teeth. He just stared at me.
You got us a serial killer.
There was no doubt about it. This was a pretty sick individual.
The so-called Night Stalker who has terrorized California.
The same man is suspected in 6 to 8 murders and 25 to 30 attacks.
I've committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings.
I saw somebody who was complete evil.
Today, we're going to explore 5 satanic true crime cases involving serial offenders. Let's begin with the first case.
They had not dealt with anyone of his caliber before. They were reluctant to admit that things like this would occur in a communist state.
They wanted to get the confession. If you read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, I think that you'll see that the confession is a very powerful symbol and very powerful element in Russian culture.
I think he is the worst. I think he would be #1 on the monster list there.
The officer sat down across from him, pulled out a notebook, and waited. The man on the other side of the table looked like a retired school teacher. Glasses, gray hair, quiet hands. Then he started talking. And he did not stop for hours. He corrected the investigators. They thought he had harmed 36 people. He said that number was wrong. The real number was 56. He listed the locations. He described details only the person responsible could know. He offered to take them to burial sites they had never found. And when they asked him how he managed to do this for 12 years, passing through checkpoints, riding public trains, living a normal life, he simply said, nobody was really looking. The question is, was he right? Between 1978 and 1990, women and children went missing across the Rostov region of southern Russia. Evidences were found near railway lines, in forests, along riverbanks, and the Soviet government said nothing publicly. The official position was clear. Problems of this nature did not exist in the USSR. So families searched alone, investigators worked in silence, and the man responsible kept boarding public trains. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in the village of Yabloknoy in Ukraine, in the middle of one of the most devastating food crises in Soviet history. Stalin's enforced agricultural collectivization had emptied villages of food and hope. Chikatilo's mother told him, from a very young age, that before he was born, his old day, whether that story was true, has never been confirmed. But it lodged in his mind permanently. He described the effect of it to investigators and psychiatrists decades later, saying it had produced in him both deep revulsion and an unhealthy fascination he never shook. His father Roman was sent to war in 1941 when Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. Roman was captured and held as a prisoner of war. In Soviet society at the time, being taken prisoner was not treated as misfortune. It was treated as dishonor and disloyalty. Roman came home after the war wearing that label, and Andrei inherited the social punishment that came with it. At school, he was already an outsider. He was bullied relentlessly. He had serious problems with his vision, but refused to wear glasses because he feared the reaction from other students. A boy with no real place among his peers and no path out of the shame his family carried. Despite everything, Chikatilo was academically strong. He became the political information officer at school and edited the school newspaper. When he finished secondary school, he applied to Moscow State University to study law, a course that would have taken him far from the village he grew up in. He failed the entrance examination. He chose to believe this was because of his father's reputation rather than his own performance. That self-justifying logic, that his failures were always the result of forces working against him, became a pattern that defined the rest of his life. He completed military service between 1957 and 1960, working in a KGB communications unit stationed in Berlin. When he returned, he settled in Rodionovka, a town near Rostov, and found work as a telephone engineer. His sister, worried that he had shown absolutely no interest in forming a relationship, arranged a meeting with a woman named Fina. They married in 1963. Despite serious and ongoing physical difficulties in their relationship, difficulties Chikatilo acknowledged frankly to investigators years later, the couple had 2 children, a daughter named Lyudmila, born in 1965, and a son named Yuri, born in 1969. From the outside, the household looked entirely unremarkable. Chikatilo enrolled at Rostov University as an external student and studied Russian literature. After completing his degree, he moved into teaching, a career that placed him in daily contact with young people and gave him an authority he had never had in any other context. In the classroom, that authority dissolved immediately. Students did not take him seriously. They mocked him. They ignored him. He had no ability to enforce discipline and no idea how to earn it. What was unfolding beneath that professional failure was far more serious. From the mid-1970s onward, a pattern of complaints began accumulating against Chikatilo from students and parents at every school he worked in. There were reports of improper physical behavior, privacy violation, and misconduct. In 1973, he harmed a 15-year-old student. The school board was told. No action followed. At one posting where he was given responsibility for overseeing a boys' dormitory, he was found committing misconduct against a student while the boy slept. Older students found out and confronted him physically. He began carrying a sharp object for protection against the students he had wronged. None of these incidents were formally reported to the police. School administrators handled each episode internally, apparently unwilling to produce documentation that would reflect badly on their institution. By 1978, he had arrived in Shakhty, a coal mining town north of Rostov, and taken a position at vocational school number 33. Around this time, without telling his wife, he purchased a small, run-down house on Mezhevoy Lane on the edge of town, across the road from the Giva River. He gave no explanation for the purchase. Nobody asked for one. On December 22, 1978, 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova was on her way home from school in Shakhty. A woman named Svetlana Guzeva, waiting at a nearby tram stop, noticed a tall, middle-aged man with glasses whispering to a young girl in a red coat. He held a shopping bag. The girl did not appear to know him. Guzeva watched as they walked away together. Her tram arrived. She got on and left. Authorities located Yelena in the Giva River 2 days later. When police searched the area around the river, they found physical evidence on the doorstep of a small house on Mezhevoy Lane, the house Chikatilo had purchased. The light inside had been left on. Neighbors confirmed who owned it. Chikatilo was brought in for questioning. His wife provided an alibi, confirming he had been home that evening. He was released. A 25-year-old local man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a prior conviction on a separate case, was subsequently arrested. Under pressure during interrogation, Kravchenko confessed. He was convicted, received the death penalty, and the sentence was carried out in the early 1980s. The person who had actually taken Yelena Zakotnova's life was already free and had moved on. He would later confirm this himself in precise detail in a KGB interrogation room 12 years later. Nearly 3 years passed after the Zakotnova case with no new incidents recorded. Then, on September 3, 1981, 17-year-old Larisa Tkachenko was found in woodland near the Rostov Public Library. She had last been seen at a nearby bus stop. June 1982. 13-year-old Lyuba Biryuk got off a bus in the Donskoy district and was followed. Investigators recovered her 2 weeks later. The summer heat had left very little for investigators to work with. July brought another case. August brought 2 more, 3 days apart. September brought 2 additional cases. By December 1982, the total for that year alone had reached 8. The individuals were diverse: young girls, young boys, women in their late teens and 20s. And that variety caused early investigators to seriously consider the possibility that more than one person was responsible. It was exactly the kind of confusion that allowed Chikatilo to continue undetected. In September 1983, Moscow dispatched Major Mikhail Fetisov and his team to Rostov after local investigators failed to produce any meaningful progress. Fetisov's assessment was direct. The local police were out of their depth, the cases were clearly the work of one individual, and the situation was being dramatically under-resourced. A new operational unit was created. Forensic specialist Viktor Burakov was placed in charge of the ground investigation. The operation was given a name: Forest Strip. For the first time, the full weight of a dedicated task force was pointed at the problem. But the Soviet system created its own obstacles. The city militia and the federal prosecutors operated in parallel with overlapping responsibilities and a chronic institutional rivalry between them. Evidence was gathered separately by different agencies and not always shared. The card index of persons of interest would eventually contain 15,000 names, and the biological evidence recovered from the cases, which investigators trusted absolutely, was sending them in the wrong direction entirely. As the investigation expanded, the pressure to show results produced serious and damaging mistakes. A man named Shabarov, who had learning difficulties, was picked up after being seen behaving strangely near a tram depot. During interrogation, he began making statements that connected him and 4 associates to several of the cases. All 5 were arrested. The questioning they faced over the following weeks was coercive and relentless. Despite confessions, the men could not correctly identify locations, deceased persons, or specific details of any individual case. While they remained in custody, the cases continued. One of the men ended his own life while detained. Eventually, the contradictions became impossible to dismiss, and all 5 were released. By 1984, Viktor Burakov had reached a point of desperation. The standard methods had failed across 6 years of searching. He made a decision that went against every established norm of Soviet law enforcement. He approached Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a psychiatrist at the Rostov Medical Institute, and asked him to construct a behavioral profile of the person they were looking for. The request was genuinely unusual. Soviet ideology had always resisted the idea that a person with serious psychological disorders could function within normal society. The suggestion implied a flaw in the system that produced that society. Bukhanovsky had no existing framework to work from. He built his approach from scratch using the limited case information Burakov could share. 10 days later, he delivered a written report. The person they were seeking was probably between 45 and 50 years old. He would have a documented history of intimate difficulties. He would present as entirely ordinary in public. He would be educated. He would have almost no genuine friendships. He would derive his only available satisfaction through acts of harm against others, because conventional intimacy was something he had never been able to access. It was not comprehensive, but the accuracy of it, measured against what would eventually be confirmed about Chikatilo, was extraordinary. Burakov kept the profile and continued building his investigation around it. Inspector Alexander Zanasovsky had been assigned to plainclothes patrol duty at the Rostov bus station in September 1984. The previous 2 confirmed cases had both originated from transport locations, and Burakov believed the person responsible kept returning to the same environments. Zanasovsky understood this instinctively. He positioned himself at the station and watched the crowd with the patience of someone who had done this for years. Within a few days, a man caught his attention. Middle-aged. Glasses. He kept moving around the station approaches, initiating conversations with young women and girls, being turned away, and then immediately redirecting his attention to the next person he spotted. The persistence was distinctive. Zanasovsky approached him and asked for identification. The man gave his name as Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He said he was a supply clerk returning from a work trip. He was calm and produced his papers without hesitation. His documents showed a connection to a KGB-affiliated division, which added a layer of bureaucratic delicacy to the situation. Zanasovsky found a way to hold him. A minor charge of harassing women in a public space, which carried 15 days of custody. When investigators used that window to search his background, they found the trail of complaints from schools across the region. They found he owned a house near the river in Shakti, the same river where Yelena Zakotnova had been found in 1978. When they searched his bag, they found a small blade, a length of rope, and Vaseline. Everything assembled itself into a clear picture. And then the laboratory results came back. The biological evidence recovered from the scenes had consistently indicated that the person responsible had type AB blood. When investigators tested Chikatilo, his blood came back type A. The 2 did not match. Under Soviet forensic science at the time, this was considered absolute. Chikatilo was, in fact, a biological non-secretor, an extremely rare condition in which the markers used to determine blood type from one form of bodily evidence do not appear in another. His blood was type A. Other biological evidence produced by his body was type AB. The laboratory result was technically accurate. The scientific assumption behind it was wrong. He was held on a minor theft charge connected to his workplace long enough to gather information. Eventually, he was released. Zanasovsky was certain they had identified the right person and continued pressing the case. His superiors reviewed the blood evidence and overruled him. Chikatilo collected his belongings, walked out of the building, and returned to the railway stations. The 6 years that followed would add dozens more cases to the file. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985, the shift toward glasnost, greater openness, allowed the investigation to operate with slightly more flexibility. Isa Kostoyev, a senior investigator from the KGB's Department of Crimes of Special Importance, was assigned overall command of the case. He restructured the operation into 3 geographically focused teams, covering Shakti, Novoshakhtinsk, and Rostov. He authorized surveillance of nightclubs and adult establishments. He put former officers dismissed for misconduct under scrutiny. He deployed hundreds of plainclothes operatives across transport hubs across the entire region. In a move that surprised many inside the investigation, Viktor Burakov visited Novocherkassk detention facility in 1985 and requested an interview with Anatoly Slivko, a separate offender awaiting execution for the harm of 7 boys. Burakov wanted to understand how a person with these tendencies was able to function within ordinary Soviet society for years without detection. The conversation gave him specific insights into patterns of behavior and the psychology of concealment that he incorporated into how the team approached their search. On August 1st, 1985, Chikatilo was in Moscow on a work trip. Near Domodedovo Airport, he encountered 18-year-old Natalia Poklistova, who appeared to be traveling alone and in difficult circumstances. He offered to accompany her. Authorities located her 2 days later, 200 meters from her home. A rope had been used. She had been struck multiple times with a sharp object. The August case and a second case the same month drove Kostoyev to request significantly more resources from Moscow. The operation was now one of the largest police mobilizations in Soviet history. Through 1986 and 1987, the cases extended to Leningrad and to Uzbekistan. Chikatilo's supply clerk position required him to travel legitimately, and he used every trip as an opportunity. In December 1985, not knowing that police helicopters were patrolling the woodland corridors near railway lines, he joined a volunteer militia search party that had been organized to help find the very person he was. He walked alongside investigators in the same forest areas where he had operated. He knew the patrol patterns because he was part of them. By 1988, the profile of the cases had shifted. Of the 16 incidents between early 1988 and Chikatilo's final arrest in November 1990, 11 involved male individuals. Dr. Bukhanovsky later noted that Chikatilo described this shift himself during the confession, explaining that by the later years, the identity of the person no longer mattered to him. What mattered was the experience of dominance and control. The act itself had become the entire purpose, disconnected from any other factor. In January 1990, 11-year-old Andrei Kravchenko was taken from the streets of Shakhty. In March, 16-year-old Yaroslav Makarov skipped school, went to the train station, and was never seen alive again. Chikatilo took him to the botanical gardens in Rostov. Yaroslav's was recovered the following day. In July, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov was waiting at a morning bus stop when he disappeared. His case also took place in the botanical gardens, within a short distance of where Yaroslav Makarov had been found months earlier. The brazenness of operating in the same location twice within months suggested either a total disregard for detection or a certainty that the person responsible would not be caught. On November 6, 1990, Sergeant Igor Rybov was on duty near a rural station called Leskos when he spotted a man emerging from the tree line. The man was moving unsteadily. His clothing showed signs of recent physical activity. There was a bandage on one finger. On his cheek and ear there were traces of what appeared to be biological material. Rybov approached him, checked his identification papers, and found nothing immediately actionable. A train arrived at the platform. There was no legal basis to detain the man further. He was allowed to board. Rybov filed a report about the encounter. Days later, the human evidence of 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik was located in the woodland near that same station. She had been taken there on the same day Rybov had seen the man at the platform. Investigators reviewing the station logs pulled the name from Rybov's report. Cross-referencing it against the case files, they began checking Chikatilo's documented work travel against the confirmed dates and locations of cases going back years. The alignment was almost complete. On November 20th, 1990, 3 plainclothes officers tracked Chikatilo to the town of Novocherkassk. They observed him making contact attempts near a local park, first approaching a boy who was quickly called away by a woman, then moving toward another child who also moved on. The officers closed in. Chikatilo was taken into custody without resistance. He sat in the back of the vehicle on the way to Rostov and said nothing at all. Officers went directly to his home. Inside, they found a hammer, more than 20 knives, and a pair of shoes that matched footprints recovered from the scene of an unidentified woman's case. When his blood and biological samples were analyzed this time, the full picture emerged. Blood type A. Other biological evidence? Type AB. He could be AB. He was the match. Sakostoyev led the interrogation personally. For days, Chikatilo said almost nothing. He wrote letters to the prosecutor's office instead, measured oddly formal documents that described inner conflict and psychological pressure without admitting to any specific act. He wrote that he was prepared to give testimony, but asked not to be pressed on details because, as he put it, his mind would not bear it. He expressed gratitude toward the investigators for apprehending him. Kostoyev asked Dr. Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had written the 1984 profile, to come in. Bukhanovsky entered the room without an investigator's posture. He told Chikatilo that what he was interested in was understanding the case from a scientific and psychological perspective. He said his goal was not prosecution, but comprehension. Chikatilo responded to this. He was then shown the psychological profile Bukhanovsky had written in 1984, the document that described the type of person investigators had been searching for. He read it through quietly. Then he said, "Yes, it's me." On December 5th, 1990, the formal confession began. He had been charged with 36 cases. He said that number was wrong. He admitted to 56. He described all the details with a precision that left investigators in no doubt about the authenticity of what they were hearing. He offered to take officers to sites they had never found. On December 7th, Chikatilo was transported to Shakhty. He led officers to the city's central cemetery and directed them to a specific location. Beneath the surface was a shallow burial site containing the human evidence of 10-year-old Alexei Kobatov, who had disappeared on August 28, 1989. His mother, Lydia Kobatova, had been waiting for 15 months with no information. She'd eventually visited a fortune teller in her desperation for any word about her son. The fortune teller had told her the boy was gone. The police had told her nothing. Chikatilo stood at the site, filmed by investigators, and watched as the evidences were uncovered. Officers present later described his expression as completely still. Among the items recovered were the boy's sneakers, which his mother identified immediately. She had bought them herself and watched him put them on the morning he left. During the confession sessions, Chikatilo explained in methodical terms how he had operated for 12 years. He said he targeted people at transport locations, bus stops, station waiting rooms, railway platforms, because those environments produced a constant flow of people who were alone, distracted, or in need of assistance. With children, he offered chewing gum or the promise of food or entertainment. With young women, he described a shortcut to another station or a quicker route home. He said the approach was never complicated. He said, "I just said to all of them, let's go. Let's have something to eat." They were everywhere, at every stop. I didn't have to look for them. He described a physical sensation that overcame him once persons affected were in a woodland area. A shaking, he said, felt like a fever. He said conventional physical response had been impossible for him since adolescence, and that the escalation to direct harm had begun at the moment of his first incident in 1978, and had continued because it was the only experience that produced any reaction in him at all. He addressed the subject of the eyes directly. He said that as a child, growing up around older folk beliefs in rural Ukraine, he had absorbed the idea that a person's final conscious image remains fixed in their eyes after death. He said he had acted on this belief across many of the cases. When investigators heard him describe it, calmly, specifically without visible emotion, some left the room, others sat down. He confirmed that Alexander Kravchenko had played no part in the 1978 Zakotnova case. That confirmation, on record, directly in the voice of the person responsible, led to Russia's Supreme Court posthumously rescinding Kravchenko's sentence in 1991. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. Andrei Chikatilo's trial, which opened on April 14, 1992, became one of the first large-scale criminal proceedings in the newly formed Russian Federation. It was held at the Rostov Regional Court, under Judge Leonid Akubzhanov. For the first time in a case of this kind in Russia, cameras and journalists were permitted inside the courtroom. Reading the charges took Judge Akubzhanov 2 full days. The case files ran to more than 200 volumes. When specific cases were described in detail, the ages, the locations, the physical evidence recovered, some people in the gallery fainted. On several occasions, members of the court security detail had to be temporarily removed and replaced because they were no longer able to remain present. Chikatilo was placed inside a steel cage at the front of the courtroom throughout the proceedings. The decision was not to protect the public from him. It was to protect him from the families seated 20 feet away. The courtroom held close to 200 people on most days. Medical staff circulated through the gallery distributing sedatives to family members whose distress became physical. Chikatilo was permitted to address the court and spoke for nearly 2 hours. He described his childhood, the period of starvation, the bullying, the failures, the humiliation. He said he had dreamed of a meaningful political career and had instead spent his life among strangers on trains and in waiting rooms. He described himself as a person systematically denied a normal existence by forces beyond his control. He assigned blame to everyone and accepted none. His behavior during the proceedings was erratic. He sang at unexpected moments. He shouted over testimony. He exposed himself to the courtroom and made a statement about his physical condition, apparently attempting to suggest that his dysfunction was a form of victimhood. Judge Akubzhanov questioned him directly multiple times about specific cases, asking how he could have carried out what the evidence showed without any apparent awareness of pain he was causing. Chikatilo's answer was always the same: "I cannot explain." One family member in the gallery called out that he was a cursed soul. Another said she wanted to do to him everything he had done to her daughter. The mother of 10-year-old Alexei Kobotov said she hoped for him the most terrible end imaginable. The judge had to repeatedly pause proceedings as the room lost its composure. At one point, a metal bar was thrown through the bars of the cage. It missed Chikatilo's head by a few centimeters. The man who threw it was briefly removed, then released. Chikatilo's defense lawyer, Murad Kabailov, argued throughout the trial that his client was not legally responsible for his actions, that the psychological evaluation showed a man incapable of rational choice. The 60-day psychiatric assessment conducted at Moscow's Serbsky Institute had identified serious abnormalities in Chikatilo's development from childhood, shaped by war, scarcity, poverty, and repeated trauma. But the evaluation's conclusion was clear. Chikatilo had retained the capacity to plan, to make deliberate choices, to adapt his behavior based on risk, and to conceal his actions across more than a decade. He had carried weapons intentionally. He had selected vulnerable targets specifically. He had traveled to unfamiliar regions to reduce the chance of recognition. The court determined he was legally competent to stand trial and to be sentenced accordingly. Judge Akubzhanov delivered his verdict in October 1992. He found Chikatilo guilty on 52 of the 53 counts brought before the court. The single omission involved one case where evidentiary certainty could not be established to the required standard. The guilty verdicts covered 21 boys aged between 8 and 16, 14 girls aged between 9 and 17, and 17 women aged 18 and above. The crimes had been committed across southern Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan between 1978 and 1990. Every guilty count carried an individual sentence. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom broke into applause. From inside the cage, Chikatilo shouted, demanded a lawyer, kicked his bench over, and called the judge a fraud. He was removed from the court. Russian President Boris Yeltsin subsequently refused his appeal personally. The sentence was final. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was taken from his cell and the sentence was carried out shortly afterward. He was 57 years old. He issued no final statement. His wife Fina and their children had already changed their names and relocated to an undisclosed address. They did not attend. Alexander Kravchenko was given death penalty in the early 1980s for the 1978 Zakotnova case, a case that Chikatilo himself admitted to, in full detail, during his December 1990 confession. Russia's Supreme Court posthumously rescinded Kravchenko's sentence in 1991. That formal exoneration arrived too late to mean anything to Kravchenko. It was a legal acknowledgement, not a remedy. His family received no explanation adequate to what had been done. At least one suspect interrogated in the early years of the investigation took his own life while in custody. Another made an attempt on his own life. A significant number of men with learning difficulties were subjected to coercive questioning techniques across the years of the search. People whose vulnerability made them easy targets for an investigation that needed to show movement. None of them were the person responsible. All of them paid a cost. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky received formal recognition from Moscow for his contribution to the investigation. The behavioral profiling methodology he developed, constructed entirely from scratch because no Soviet framework for it existed, became the foundation for a new department within Russian law enforcement dedicated specifically to cases of serious and repeated offending. The Chikatilo investigation became one of the most studied cases in the development of criminal behavioral science, referenced in training programs across multiple countries. Inspector Zanasovsky, who had identified Chikatilo in 1984, who had held him, and who had been demoted for refusing to accept the blood type result as the final word, was never formally rehabilitated. When the 1990 arrest was confirmed to be the same man he had flagged 6 years earlier, he was asked by journalists how he felt. He said he was angry. He said that was not an adequate word for it. He said he had known all along, and that the knowledge had not protected anyone. Chikatilo admitted to 56 cases. He was convicted on 52. The true number has never been established with certainty. His work travel took him to regions and cities across the Soviet Union over more than a decade, and the investigation focused primarily on the Rostov area. Cases he described during confession from locations further afield had never previously been connected to any investigation. Some families were notified for the first time during the confession process that their lost, damned relative had been found. 52 confirmed people. 21 boys, 14 girls, 17 women. Children who had been to the cinema, teenagers who had run away from difficult situations and were trying to get somewhere better. Young women who were offered a meal or a shorter route home. People who trusted a tall, quiet man with glasses who said he knew a shortcut. Let's go. They followed him. They had no reason not to. Their names are on the court record. Their cases filled more than 200 volumes. For many of their families, the trial produced a verdict, but not a resolution. The resolution they needed was the one that had been available in 1984 and was not taken. That is the part of this story that no court document addresses, and that no sentence changes. Chikatilo was found guilty on 52 counts. Every single one came with a death sentence. On February 14, 1994, it was carried out. The man wrongly given the death penalty for his first case, Alexander Kravchenko, was officially cleared the year before. 52 families never got the full answer they were owed. Know these cases, share this video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because the next story is one that deserves to be heard. Stay safe. Stay aware. Now let's move on to the second disturbing true crime story.
The suspect has used guns, knives, tire irons.
I knew how vicious and violent he really was.
Their final hours were at the hands of someone who was laughing as he tortured and raped and killed them.
A serial murderer who broke all the rules.
I think he is the worst. I think he would be number one on the monster list there.
I don't feel guilt. Guilt is a human emotion I simply don't experience. These were the words Richard Ramirez spoke calmly across the interrogation table. No remorse. No recognition that his victims were human beings. Just cold. Indifferent. Detective Gil Carrillo had expected a monster. A wild person. Someone obviously broken. Instead, he found something far more terrifying. The Night Stalker was articulate. Intelligent. Frighteningly composed as he discussed his crimes like someone reviewing their daily schedule. Carrillo pressed him. What about the families he'd destroyed? The children he'd traumatized? The elderly victims who died terrified in their own homes? Ramirez's eyes were empty as he responded. He described studying serial killers throughout history, from ancient Rome to modern times. He talked about their methods, their successes, their mistakes. Like a student discussing coursework. He'd been preparing, learning, perfecting his craft. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated evil. And what Detective Carrillo discovered in that interrogation room would reveal just how deep the darkness truly went. Before he became the Night Stalker, before he terrorized Southern California, before his name became synonymous with evil, he was Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez. Born February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. The youngest of 5 children born to Mexican immigrants, Mercedes and Julian Ramirez. El Paso was a border town sitting directly across the Rio Grande from Juarez, Mexico. It was a heavily Hispanic community where families worked hard to build better lives for their children. The Ramirez family lived in a modest neighborhood where everyone knew each other. His mother, Mercedes, worked in a boot factory while pregnant with Ricardo, exposed to chemical fumes every single day without any protective equipment or safety measures. The long-term effects of this exposure would never be fully understood, but some researchers would later point to potential developmental impacts. His father, Julian, a former policeman in Mexico who now worked for the railroad, ruled the household with an iron fist and a violent temper that could erupt without warning. He was hard-working, trying to provide for his family in a new country, but his methods of discipline were harsh, and his anger was unpredictable. Violence entered Ricardo's life almost from the moment he could walk. At age 2, a heavy dresser fell on him in the family home, splitting his forehead open and requiring stitches. The injury left a visible scar he would carry for the rest of his life. At 5 years old, he was knocked unconscious by a swing at a playground. The blow to his head was severe enough that he lost consciousness completely. After that second incident, he began experiencing epileptic seizures. The seizures would affect him throughout his childhood and into his teenage years, causing him to shake uncontrollably and sometimes lose consciousness in the middle of class. Teachers and classmates witnessed these episodes regularly. These severe head injuries would later be examined by psychologists and neurologists, who would note their potential impact on brain development, impulse control, and violent tendencies. But the physical trauma was only the beginning of what would shape him. His father's explosive rage meant beatings were a regular occurrence in the Ramirez household. The children never knew when an outburst would happen or what might trigger Julian's anger. They lived in constant apprehension, walking on eggshells. By the time Ricardo was 10 years old, he had discovered marijuana as an escape from his reality at home. The drug helped him forget about his father's violence, his seizures, his feeling of being different from other children. It was the beginning of a relationship with substances that would only deepen and darken. Then his older cousin Miguel came into his life in a significant and devastating way. Miguel was a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had recently returned from combat. He had served his country and seen action in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But the war had changed him fundamentally. He had seen and done things in Vietnam that had twisted something inside him. Miguel would show Ricardo graphic photographs, horrific images of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and harmed during the war. Pictures of bodies, of violence, of atrocities committed in the jungle. He would tell detailed, disturbing stories of torture and cruelty, using these photographs as proof that he was telling the truth. They would smoke marijuana together in Miguel's apartment while the older man shared these twisted tales, normalizing brutality and violence in the impressionable young boy's mind. Ricardo wasn't recoiling in horror at these stories. He was fascinated, drawn in, asking questions. The boy was absorbing lessons that no child should ever learn. Lessons about how to hurt people. Lessons about how to break into places without being detected. Lessons that violence could be exciting, thrilling, even sexually arousing. Miguel was teaching his young cousin that cruelty was acceptable, even admirable. Then came May 4th, 1973. Ricardo was 12 years old, still in middle school, still forming his understanding of right and wrong. He was present at Miguel's apartment when his cousin got into an argument with his wife, Jessie. The argument started over something trivial and escalated quickly, as domestic disputes often do. But what happened next was anything but typical. Miguel pulled out a gun, and in front of his 12-year-old cousin, without hesitation or remorse, he shot Jessie in the face, ending her life instantly. Ricardo watched the entire thing happen, saw Miguel grab the gun, heard the deafening shot in the enclosed space, saw his cousin's wife fall to the floor, saw the blood spreading across the carpet, watched as the life left her eyes, Miguel was arrested immediately and eventually convicted of his wife's murder, serving only a few years in prison before being released. But for young Ricardo, the damage was already done. Something fundamental had broken inside him that day. The line between right and wrong, between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, had been completely erased from his mind. Witnessing that act of violence at such a formative age, from someone he looked up to and admired, cemented in his mind that taking a life was not only possible, but could be done without consequence or remorse. After witnessing that incident, Ricardo's behavior deteriorated rapidly and noticeably. He began breaking into homes in his neighborhood, starting with small thefts and gradually becoming bolder. He started using heavier substances beyond marijuana, experimenting with anything he could get his hands on. By his teenage years, he was burglarizing houses regularly to support his growing addiction to drugs. School held no interest for him anymore. His grades dropped. His attendance became sporadic. He was hanging out with a rougher crowd, kids who were involved in petty crime and substance use. Eventually, he dropped out of high school altogether and began drifting through life without any direction, purpose, or legitimate means of supporting himself. His neighbors in El Paso started calling him Dados, Fingers, and Ricky Robin, Ricky the Thief. His reputation for stealing anything that wasn't nailed down became well known in the community. If something went missing, people suspected Ricardo first. He eventually made his way to California, leaving Texas behind for what he saw as better opportunities. He took a job at a Holiday Inn in Los Angeles, where he was given a master key as part of his employment. Instead of using it responsibly, he used that key to steal from guests while they slept in their rooms. On at least one documented occasion, he committed crimes against children in an elevator at the hotel. He was never reported for these incidents, and the full extent of what occurred remains unknown. His employment at the Holiday Inn ended abruptly when he attempted to assault a woman in her hotel room and was caught in the act by the victim's husband. By his early 20s, Ricardo had fully transformed into Richard Ramirez. He had left his birth name behind, along with any pretense of living a normal life. He was using cocaine heavily and regularly, often staying awake for days at a time during drug binges. The cocaine fueled his paranoia and aggression, while also requiring constant money to maintain his habit. He had developed a deep obsession with Satanism and the occult. He attended concerts by bands like AC/DC, becoming particularly fixated on their song Night Prowler, which was about someone who breaks into homes at night. He listened to the song repeatedly, absorbing its dark message. He began to believe he was protected by dark forces, that Satan himself was watching over him and making him invisible to consequences. This belief system gave him permission to act on his darkest impulses without guilt or fear of punishment. Everything was converging into a perfect storm. The skills Miguel had taught him about breaking and entering, the complete desensitization to violence he had witnessed at age 12, the occult beliefs that gave him a twisted sense of purpose and divine permission to harm others. All of it was building towards something terrible. Something that would soon erupt into violence across Southern California. And in June 1984, it finally began. The nightmare began in the early hours of June 28, 1984, in Glassell Park, a working-class neighborhood in Los Angeles where people knew their neighbors by name and felt safe walking to the corner store at night. Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old woman who lived alone in a small ground-floor apartment, was found deceased in her bedroom by a neighbor who had come to check on her. The scene was absolutely horrifying. She had been harmed with extreme violence in her own bed. The apartment showed clear signs of burglary, with items taken and drawers ransacked. Investigators from the Los Angeles Police Department documented everything meticulously, collected all available evidence, and began the painstaking process of interviewing neighbors and anyone who might have seen something suspicious in the area. But there were no witnesses who had seen anyone suspicious lurking around the apartment building. The physical evidence was limited by the technology available in 1984, which was far less advanced than what would be available even a few years later. There were no clear suspects emerging from the investigation, no obvious leads to follow. The case went cold relatively quickly. Detectives worked it as best they could with the resources and information available to them, but eventually other cases demanded their attention and resources. Homicides were unfortunately common in Los Angeles, and without leads, this case became just another tragic unsolved crime. It seemed like a terrible but isolated incident. A random burglary gone wrong. An elderly woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nobody realized this was just the beginning. But the person responsible wasn't finished. He was just getting started. And for the next 9 months, he would lay low, perhaps perfecting his methods, perhaps waiting for the right time to strike again, perhaps enjoying the knowledge that he had gotten away with it completely. On March 17, 1985, 9 months after the attack on Jenny Vinchow, the violence resumed with shocking and sudden intensity. In Rosemead, California, a quiet residential community east of Los Angeles, Maria Hernandez was entering her garage after coming home late from work. She was tired from her shift, thinking about getting inside her apartment and relaxing for the evening, maybe watching some television before bed. Suddenly, a man in a baseball cap approached her from the shadows of her garage. She hadn't seen him hiding there, waiting for her. Before she could react or scream for help, she saw the gun in his hand pointed directly at her face. Time seemed to slow down. Acting on pure survival instinct, she raised her hands defensively in front of her face. She happened to be holding her car keys in her hand, and in that split-second movement, the bullet struck the metal keys instead of her head. The round deflected just enough to graze her hand instead of ending her life instantly. She fell to the ground, blood streaming from the wound in her hand. She made a decision in that moment that saved her life. Despite the searing pain and overwhelming horror of what was happening, she lay completely still on the garage floor and pretended to be gone. She controlled her breathing. She didn't move a muscle. She made herself appear lifeless. The intruder stepped over her motionless body without a second glance, apparently satisfied that she was no longer a threat, and entered the home. Inside, he found her roommate, Dale Okazaki, a 34-year-old woman. Within minutes, Dale had lost her life to a single gunshot. But he wasn't finished for the night. His bloodlust wasn't satisfied. He got into a vehicle and drove to Monterey Park, arriving barely an hour later at a different location miles away. There, purely by chance, he encountered Tsai Lian Yu, a 30-year-old law student who was pulling groceries from her car after a trip to the market. She was probably thinking about studying for an upcoming exam or preparing dinner. She was attacked viciously right there in the street, shot twice in the chest at close range. She passed away before the ambulance could reach the hospital, despite the best efforts of paramedics who tried desperately to save her life. 2 separate attacks in one night. 2 different cities. 2 different victims who had absolutely nothing connecting them to each other. Law enforcement agencies across Los Angeles County were beginning to realize they were dealing with something completely unprecedented and extremely dangerous. What followed was a wave of violence that seemed unstoppable and utterly random. On March 27th, in Whittier, Vincent and Maxine Zazzara were found deceased in their home. Vincent, 64, had been shot as he slept. Maxine, 44, suffered multiple stab wounds. But what made this scene particularly disturbing was what investigators found throughout the house. Occult symbols, including pentagrams, were carved into surfaces and drawn on walls. The symbols were deliberate, carefully placed, suggesting ritualistic elements that went beyond simple burglary. Even more disturbing, Maxine's eyes had been removed and were never recovered. The killer was taking trophies, keeping parts of his victims as souvenirs to relive his crimes. This wasn't just about harming people or stealing valuables. There was something twisted, something ritualistic happening. The attacks continued with increasing frequency. In May, Harold Wu, 66, and his wife Jean, 63, were attacked in their Monterey Park home. Both were beaten severely. Then Bill Doy was shot in the head and later passed away. His wife Lillian survived a brutal assault, beaten and restrained while her husband lay dying. A disturbing pattern emerged. He wasn't just taking lives quickly. He was terrorizing survivors, forcing them to swear loyalty to Satan. Speaking about dark beliefs and evil forces, he would make them repeat phrases worshiping the devil while he assaulted them. He ransacked homes methodically for valuables, jewelry, cash, anything he could carry away and sell for drug money. And he continued leaving occult symbols at scene after scene, as if wanting investigators to know these weren't ordinary crimes driven by greed or anger. There was something darker motivating him. By June 1985, absolute panic had spread across Southern California like wildfire. The media reported almost daily on new attacks. Every morning brought fresh horror stories. Every evening news broadcast opened with the same terrifying question: where will he strike next? Gun stores throughout Los Angeles County reported unprecedented sales figures, with people who had never touched a firearm now buying them for protection. Background checks that usually took hours were now taking days because of overwhelming demand. Hardware stores sold out of all security equipment within days of getting new shipments. Locks, deadbolts, window bars, alarm systems. Manufacturers ran factories at maximum capacity, but still couldn't meet demand. People who had lived in their homes for decades without locking windows were now installing multiple layers of security. Heavy iron bars went over windows, multiple deadbolts on every door, motion sensor lights around home perimeters. The psychological impact was profound. Parents kept children home from summer activities, too afraid to let them out of sight. Elderly residents whose statistics showed were being disproportionately targeted stopped living independently, moving in with adult children who could watch over them. Every evening, news broadcast led with Night Stalker updates. Newspapers sold out daily as people desperate for information bought multiple copies. Police departments received thousands of tips daily. Special phone lines were set up to handle the overwhelming volume. Operators worked around the clock taking reports from citizens who thought they saw something suspicious, who wanted to report a strange neighbor, who had theories about the killer's identity. Despite all these tips, despite the massive task force assembled, despite thousands of hours of detective work, the person responsible remained completely invisible, always one step ahead of law enforcement. On July 2nd, Mary Louise Cannon, 75, was found deceased in her Arcadia home, beaten severely with a blunt object, her skull fractured from repeated strikes. The brutality was escalating with each incident. 3 days later, Whitney Bennett, just 16, was attacked in her Sierra Madre home while she slept. The assailant beat her savagely with a tire iron, fracturing her skull in multiple places. Miraculously, she survived. Her parents found her in the hallway, covered in blood, barely conscious. She required hundreds of stitches. On July 7th, Joyce Lucille Nelson, 61, was found beaten to death in her Monterey Park home. The brutality was escalating with each attack. Then came July 20th, one of the most active and violent nights in the entire spree. In Glendale, Maxon Kneading, 66, and his wife Layla, 64, were found deceased. They had lived in that house for over 20 years. The same night in Sun Valley, Chainarong Kovananth, 32, lost his life while his wife Somkid, 29, survived brutal assault. The offender shot Chainarong as he slept, then forced Somkid to reveal where valuables were hidden, assaulting her while their 8-year-old son slept nearby. 2 separate locations, 2 different families destroyed, in a single night. The frequency was becoming almost unbearable. Detectives were working 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, desperately trying to find some pattern, some clue, some break that would lead them to this monster. 5 days later, he struck again in Burbank, shooting a husband and assaulting his wife. At several different scenes, distinctive Avia aerobic sneaker prints were found, in soil outside windows where the offender had entered, in blood inside homes where he had walked, on various surfaces throughout crime scenes. These particular shoes were relatively rare, with only 1,354 pairs sold in California during the relevant time period. The distinctive circular pattern on the sole made them easy to identify and compare. This was the first concrete physical evidence definitively linking crimes together. It proved scientifically that one person was responsible for multiple attacks across different cities. This wasn't multiple offenders. This was one individual terrorizing an entire region. Forensic technicians carefully photographed each print and created detailed plaster casts. The distinctive circular pattern with specific wear marks, a small notch here, a scratch there, appeared at scene after scene after scene. Then came the second crucial breakthrough that would prove even more valuable: the ballistics match. Bullets recovered from different crime scenes were carefully analyzed by firearms experts using comparison microscopes. They discovered that bullets from several scenes had all been fired from the same .22 caliber handgun. When examined under powerful magnification, the striations, tiny scratches left by imperfections in the gun barrel, matched perfectly across multiple bullets. Every gun barrel has unique imperfections, like fingerprints. When a bullet is fired, these imperfections leave distinctive marks. The matches were irrefutable and scientifically sound. This was absolute proof that the same weapon had been used in multiple attacks. Combined with the shoe print evidence, investigators had confirmation they were hunting one individual responsible for numerous crimes across Southern California. The task force grew to include detectives from a dozen different jurisdictions. They established a command center at Los Angeles Police Department headquarters, where all evidence could be stored, analyzed, and compared in one central location. They worked around the clock in shifts, ensuring someone was always analyzing evidence 24 hours a day. Patterns emerged clearly through careful analysis. Most attacks occurred between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., when people were in their deepest sleep and least likely to hear an intruder. Entry was usually through unlocked windows. He would try windows systematically until he found one that opened easily, though he would force entry if necessary. The perpetrator traveled significant distances between attacks, sometimes striking in 2 different cities on the same night, which suggested he had access to a vehicle and was comfortable driving around Los Angeles. But who was he? That remained the crucial unanswered question. The noose was tightening, even if the person responsible didn't realize it yet. On August 6th, in Northridge, Christopher and Virginia Peterson survived an attack that would provide investigators with a vital piece of information. Virginia provided detectives with a detailed description. A tall, thin man with dark hair and notably terrible dental hygiene. His teeth were badly rotted, stained brown and black with severe decay. This description proved incredibly important and specific. The dental detail was so unusual and distinctive that it stood out immediately. Investigators went back to previous survivors who had seen their attacker's face, and several confirmed they distinctly remembered noticing badly decayed teeth during their attacks. This physical characteristic was rare enough to be useful. It wasn't just tall, thin man with dark hair that could describe thousands of people. But terrible dental decay? That narrowed things down considerably. 2 days later, on August 8th, Ahmed Zia was shot in his Diamond Bar home. His wife, Sue Key, was assaulted and robbed. The attacks were becoming more frequent again, as if the offender felt completely untouchable. On August 17th, the attacks moved north to San Francisco, 380 miles away, and San Francisco immediately contacted the Los Angeles task force, recognizing the similarities. The offender had expanded his territory. He was no longer confining himself to Southern California. The entire state was now his hunting ground. The stolen orange Toyota was found abandoned in Los Angeles' Rampart district on August 13, 1985, parked on a street like any other vehicle. When forensic technicians processed the vehicle thoroughly, examining every surface, checking every area where someone might have touched the car, they discovered an important clue: a clear, perfect fingerprint on the rearview mirror. Think about that for a moment. Out of all the surfaces in a car, out of all the places he could have touched, this one fingerprint survived. Clear enough to analyze, distinct enough to compare. The print was immediately photographed and run through the new automated fingerprint identification system. Technology that was still relatively cutting edge in 1985. This system could compare one fingerprint against thousands in a database in hours, rather than the weeks or months manual comparison would require. Within hours, they had a match. Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with a criminal history for auto theft and other petty crimes. His fingerprints were in the system because of previous arrests. Law enforcement finally had a face and a name after more than a year of hunting a shadow. They had him. Detective Gil Carrillo and his partners reviewed Ramirez's file immediately. The photograph showed a thin man with dark hair. They checked. Yes. Dental records indicated severe tooth decay. The physical description matched what survivors had reported. They obtained all available information. Known associates. Last known addresses. Family connections. Criminal history. Everything they could find. But there was a problem. Richard Ramirez's current whereabouts were unknown. He was a drifter, living on the streets or in cheap motels, moving constantly. He had no permanent address, no regular employment, no established pattern of life that would make him easy to locate. They had identified him. Now, they had to find him. And they had to make a difficult decision. Go public, or keep it quiet. On August 30th, 1985, law enforcement made an unprecedented decision. They released Richard Ramirez's photograph and name to every media outlet throughout California. Within hours, his face appeared on every major newspaper front page. Every television station broadcast his booking photo repeatedly. The decision was debated extensively. Some worried it would drive him underground. Others argued public awareness was their best tool. They chose to go public. Ramirez had been visiting his brother in Tucson, Arizona, completely unaware he'd been identified. When he returned to Los Angeles on August 31st, stepping off a Greyhound bus, he walked into a liquor store and saw his own face staring back from newspaper racks. The headline screamed, "Night Stalker identified." He fled the store immediately, his face pale with panic. What happened next became legendary in Los Angeles history. Ramirez ran desperately through East Los Angeles streets, attempting to steal a car from Faustino Piñon at a stoplight. But Piñon fought back hard, refusing to give up his car. He wrestled with Ramirez and began calling loudly for help. Residents began recognizing Ramirez from the photographs they'd seen all morning. His face had been everywhere. Someone shouted, "It's him! It's the Night Stalker!" The cry was taken up by others. "El Matador!" Dozens of residents poured into the streets, chasing Ramirez as he ran through neighborhoods, jumping fences, cutting through alleys, attempting to take multiple vehicles in his frantic escape. He tried to take another car from Angelina de la Torre, but she grabbed a metal rod and hit him repeatedly in the head and shoulders, refusing to be a victim. Jose Burgon joined the pursuit with a barbecue fork. The crowd grew larger and angrier. Ramirez finally attempted to enter a home on Hubbard Street, perhaps hoping to hide inside or take hostages. But homeowner Manuel de la Torre was ready. He struck Ramirez repeatedly with a heavy steel rod, hitting him hard enough to knock him down. Other residents surrounded him immediately, making sure he couldn't get back up. They held him there, some wanting to deliver their own justice. By the time police arrived, responding to multiple frantic 911 calls, Ramirez was already subdued on the ground, surrounded by dozens of residents who had risked their safety to stop him. The crowd was angry. Officers had to push through to reach him. When finally placed in handcuffs and put in a patrol car, Ramirez reportedly said, "Thank God you came." He knew the community's anger was justified, and he was lucky to be in police custody rather than facing the mob. Richard Ramirez's trial began in July 1988, nearly 3 years after his capture. The delays were caused by the case's extreme complexity, connecting evidence from dozens of crime scenes, coordinating testimony from numerous survivors, and dealing with Ramirez's disruptive behavior during preliminary proceedings. During the trial, Ramirez displayed shocking behavior that revealed his complete lack of remorse or humanity. He showed a pentagram drawn on his palm to cameras, making sure photographers captured the symbol clearly. He shouted, "Hail Satan," in the courtroom multiple times, disrupting proceedings. He smiled and laughed when evidence of his crimes was presented. He showed absolutely no remorse, no guilt, no acknowledgement that his victims were human beings who had suffered because of him. The prosecution presented their case methodically and thoroughly. Survivors testified bravely, facing the man who had terrorized them, describing their experiences in detail despite the trauma of reliving those moments. Inez Erickson took the stand and described how Ramirez shot Bill Carnes 3 times in the head, then assaulted her repeatedly while forcing her to swear she loved Satan. Her voice was steady as she testified, even as she described the worst night of her life. Somkid Kovananth testified about the night her husband was taken from her, about being assaulted while her young son slept nearby, about the terror that still haunted her years later. Virginia Peterson described the attack in detail and confirmed the distinctive details she remembered most vividly: the attacker's severely rotted teeth. Forensic experts presented overwhelming evidence. fingerprints from the stolen car matching Ramirez exactly, ballistics linking multiple attacks to the same weapon, distinctive shoe prints appearing at scene after scene, and survivor identifications. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, but the evidence was simply too strong, too comprehensive, too scientifically sound. The prosecution presented evidence of 13 cases of taking life, 5 attempted cases, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries across multiple jurisdictions. The sheer scope of the crimes was staggering. On September 20th, 1989, after 22 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on all 43 counts. During the penalty phase, Ramirez addressed the court. "You don't understand me. You are not expected to. You are not capable of it. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil." This statement demonstrated he felt no remorse, no guilt, no humanity. He saw himself as beyond normal moral judgment. On November 7th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was formally sentenced. He received 19 separate sentences for ending life and numerous additional sentences for his other crimes. As he was led from the courtroom, he said loudly, "Big deal. Dying is no big deal. We all die. I'll be in hell with the devil." Richard Ramirez was transported to San Quentin State Prison. Over the years, he received numerous letters from admirers. He even married one of his followers, Doreen Leoy, in 1996. Multiple appeals were filed, but none succeeded. The evidence was too strong. In 2009, DNA evidence connected Ramirez to an additional crime: the assault and taking of the life of 9-year-old Mei Leung in San Francisco on April 10, 1984. This meant his spree had lasted even longer than anyone knew, and his youngest victim was even younger than previously documented. On June 7, 2013, at age 53, Richard Ramirez passed away at Marin General Hospital from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. He had been incarcerated for nearly 24 years. He never showed remorse in all those years. He was never given the punishment the court ordered, instead dying of natural causes. The Night Stalker case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached investigations across multiple jurisdictions. It led to better cooperation between departments and demonstrated the importance of sharing information quickly. The task force model became a blueprint for future investigations. Improvements in forensic technology, particularly the automated fingerprint identification system, became a model for implementation nationwide. For victims and families, the scars never fully healed. Survivors spoke publicly about decades of trauma, of never feeling truly safe again. Some required years of therapy. Some moved away from California entirely. Children who witnessed these crimes or lost parents grew up forever changed. But the case also revealed something powerful about community action. It was ordinary citizens who ultimately stopped Richard Ramirez. Manuel de la Torre, Faustino Piñon, Angelina de la Torre, and dozens of other residents showed incredible courage. They took back their streets, protected their neighbors, and did what law enforcement had been unable to do for over a year. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most studied cases in American criminal history, examined in criminal justice courses and forensic science programs. The lessons learned continue to influence law enforcement today. The importance of interjurisdictional cooperation, the value of community involvement, the power of forensic technology, and the need for public awareness campaigns when appropriate. The name Richard Ramirez will forever be associated with darkness and violence. But the story of how he was caught will forever be associated with community courage, forensic innovation, and the determination of investigators who never gave up. The Night Stalker case reminds us that safety requires vigilance and community awareness. Lock your doors, watch out for neighbors, and report suspicious activity immediately. If this story opened your eyes to the importance of safety, share it with others and subscribe to stay informed. Together, we can create safer communities and prevent future tragedies. Now let's move on to the third disturbing true crime story.
We have a portion of the rope from the noose that was used to hang Carl Panzram. We also have the blindfold cloth that actually went over his eyes.
I don't want any Bible-backed hypocrites at my funeral. Run them out, and I will go out under my own power. I don't want to cause any trouble, for I'm as anxious to get it over with as you are.
Because Warnke was murdered inside a federal prison, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had jurisdictional authority on conducting the investigation, and they determined that Carl Panzram was writing to Henry James, who they verified as being Henry Lesser.
He moved through America under different names, slipping in and out of prisons 9 times before anyone realized who they were really dealing with. A 6-foot-tall figure who left a path of violence across 3 continents in the early 20th century. On July 1928, Washington, D.C. City Jail. Guards heard a voice coming from one of the cells. The prisoner inside was talking about taking lives, multiple lives, in different cities, over many years. The guards didn't believe him. Prisoners said crazy things all the time to get attention or seem dangerous. But then they started checking his claims. The prisoner had been arrested for burglary under the name John O'Leary, but that wasn't his real identity. He'd used Jeff Davis in one city, Jack Allen in another, Teddy Bedard somewhere else. When investigators finally connected the cases, they discovered something disturbing. A young prison guard noticed this prisoner was different. Most inmates spent their time causing trouble or complaining. This one wanted to write. The guard gave him a pencil and paper. What came back wasn't letters or stories. It was a detailed autobiography. Page after page of confessions. Crimes police didn't know about. He simply wanted someone to know what he'd done. Investigators built a timeline from his writings. The pattern was chilling. But the truly disturbing part was what happened between prison sentences. During the brief periods of freedom, that's when most of the damage occurred. By the time authorities pieced together his full story, he'd admitted to at least 21 deaths. Some experts believe the real number was higher. This is the story of Carl Panzram, and it starts long before anyone knew his real name. His name was Carl Panzram, born on a failing farm near East Grand Forks, Minnesota. This child would grow into one of the most dangerous criminals America has ever produced. But on that summer day in 1891, he was just another baby. The 6th of 7 children born to Johann and Matilda Panzram, 2 East Prussian immigrants struggling to survive on American soil. The Panzram farm was a place of misery. Crops barely grew. Money was always scarce. The children worked from dawn until they collapsed at night. And young Carl, even from his earliest memories, felt different, disconnected. Angry at a world that seemed designed to crush him before he could even walk. But the real nightmare hadn't begun yet. That would come later, when his father made a decision that would change everything. When Carl was 7 years old, he woke up one morning to discover his father was gone. Johann Panzram had simply vanished, left his wife, left his 7 children, left everything behind. He never came back, never sent word, just disappeared. Now Matilda was alone with 7 mouths to feed and a farm that barely produced enough to keep them alive. The burden fell on the children. Carl, still just a small boy, was forced to work even harder. 2 hours of sleep per night, then back to the fields. School when he could, work always. Something inside Carl began to break. Or maybe it was already broken, and the abandonment just made it worse. By age 5, he was stealing. By age 8, he was lying constantly. By age 10, he felt nothing but anger. His mother couldn't control him. Nobody could. At age 12, Carl broke into a neighbor's home and stole cake, apples, and a revolver. It seemed like typical juvenile delinquency. A hungry, angry boy taking what he wanted. But this single act would seal his fate. His mother made a decision. She sent Carl to the Minnesota State Training School in Red Wing, a reform institution that promised to straighten out troubled boys. She had no idea she was sending her son to hell. The Minnesota State Training School was not a place of reform. It was a house of horrors disguised as a correction facility. And there was one place the boys feared above all others. They called it the paint shop. And in that workshop would haunt Carl Panzram for the rest of his life. And through him would haunt the world. Was beaten with fists, with implements, with anything the staff could find. He was assaulted repeatedly. He was tortured for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all, except that the adults could, and no one would stop them. The abuse was so severe, so constant, that it rewired something fundamental in Carl's brain. Whatever capacity for empathy he might have had was beaten out of him. Whatever hope for a normal life was crushed under the weight of adult cruelty. Years later, he would write with bitter clarity, "I was reformed all right. I had been taught by Christians how to be a hypocrite and a sneak. I had learned more about stealing, lying, hating, burning, and harming than I ever knew existed. I learned that a boy's body could be used for things I had never imagined. And I learned that adults could be monsters worse than anything in children's nightmares." The rage was building, growing stronger every day, and soon it would explode. On July 7th, 1905, Carl Panzram committed his first act of revenge. He successfully burned down a building at the Minnesota State Training School. He did it carefully, without detection, and watched as the place that had tortured him went up in flames. Some accounts suggest a boy died in that fire, though this was never confirmed. After being paroled in January 1906, Carl, now a teenager, ran away from home for good. He began riding freight trains across America, living the dangerous life of a hobo. During one of these train rides, he later claimed he was gang attacked by a group of other transients, an experience that left him, in his words, a sadder, sicker, but wiser boy. His hatred for humanity was growing stronger every day. In 1907, at age 15, Panzram got drunk in a Montana saloon and enlisted in the United States Army. He thought maybe military discipline would give his life structure. Instead, it gave him his first taste of Leavenworth. Panzram was rebellious, insubordinate, and refused to follow orders. When he was caught stealing $88 worth of supplies, the military came down hard. Secretary of War William Howard Taft himself approved Panzram's sentence. 3 years of hard labor at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Those 3 years broke whatever small piece of humanity Panzram had left. The guards beat him. They hung him from rafters for hours at a time. They turned water hoses on him in winter. They locked him in solitary confinement for days, sometimes weeks, with barely any food. He claimed he survived by eating cockroaches. Panzram later wrote, "I was a pretty rotten egg before I went there, but when I left there, all the good that may have been in me had been kicked and beaten out of me." He left Leavenworth in 1910 with an all-consuming hatred for William Howard Taft, specifically, and humanity in general. That hatred would soon turn deadly. Throughout the 1910s, Panzram's criminal career escalated. He committed burglaries across the western United States. He was caught, imprisoned, escaped, caught again. An endless cycle. Each time he was imprisoned, the guards subjected him to brutal treatment. Each time, his rage grew stronger. In 1915, while imprisoned at Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Panzram helped a fellow inmate named Otto Hooker escape. During the escape attempt, Hooker ended the life of Warden Minto. This marked Panzram's first connection to a case involving someone losing their life, as an accessory before the fact. Panzram himself escaped from Salem on September 18, 1917, after 61 days in solitary confinement. He shaved his mustache and began using aliases. He would never return to the Pacific Northwest. But the worst was yet to come. By 1920, Panzram would begin his true reign of terror. September 16, 1920, New Haven, Connecticut. Carl Panzram stood outside a mansion in the darkness, studying the windows, the locks, the patterns of movement inside. This wasn't just any house. This was the home of former President William Howard Taft, the same man who, years earlier, had personally approved Panzram's brutal sentence to Leavenworth. Panzram had been waiting for this moment, planning it, dreaming about it. That night, he broke in. Moving through Taft's home like a shadow, he stole thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and bonds. He took Taft's inscribed service watch, a personal trophy. But the prize he wanted most was sitting in a drawer. Taft's personal Colt M1911.45 caliber handgun. When Panzram left that mansion, he wasn't just carrying stolen goods. He was carrying the weapon of his revenge. With Taft's money, Panzram purchased a small yacht and named it the Akista. To anyone watching, he looked like a successful businessman, a captain ready to hire crew and sail the waters around New York. But the Akista wasn't a yacht. It was a floating tomb. For 3 months, Panzram haunted the bars near the New York waterfront, looking for a specific type of person. Sailors, drifters, men who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. Men who were down on their luck and desperate for work. "Looking for crew," he'd say, buying drinks, friendly and charming. "Good pay, easy work. Just need some hands on my yacht." The men would smile, shake his hand, excited for the opportunity. They had no idea they were shaking hands with their own end. Panzram would bring them to City Island in the Bronx, where the Akista was docked. Once aboard, he'd offer more drinks. Strong drinks. Keep pouring until the men were intoxicated, vulnerable, unable to fight back effectively. Then the monster would emerge. What came next on that yacht was so horrific that even Panzram's written confession, decades later, would make investigators physically ill. He would assault the men. Then, using President Taft's stolen weapon, he would end their lives. But he didn't stop there. The bodies had to disappear. And Panzram had found the perfect place, a spot in Long Island Sound called Execution Rocks Light. He would weight down the bodies and dump them in the dark waters, where the currents and sea life would do the rest. 10 sailors who walked onto the Akista looking for honest work and never walked off. 10 men who trusted the wrong person on the wrong night. But here's the terrifying truth. We may never know the real number. Bodies dumped in the ocean don't always surface. Many of Panzram's victims were drifters, men without families actively looking for them. In 1920, missing persons cases weren't tracked the way they are today. 10 confirmed by Panzram's confession. Possibly more. The spree only ended when the Akista ran aground and sank near Atlantic City, New Jersey in October 1920. Panzram's last 2 intended victims managed to escape during the chaos of the sinking. They fled into the night, confused, traumatized, having no idea how close they'd come to joining the others at the bottom of Long Island Sound. After the yacht sank and his crimes in New York reached their end, Panzram did what any smart fugitive would do. He ran. He ran to another continent. Jumping bail on various charges, Panzram stowed away on a ship bound for Africa. When he arrived in Luanda, the capital of Portuguese Angola, in late 1921, he managed to talk his way into a job with the Sinclair Oil Company. They needed a foreman for an oil drilling rig, and Panzram, using one of his many false identities, seemed qualified. But Carl Panzram couldn't control himself. Not in New York, not in Africa, not anywhere. After conflicts with his supervisor, which included burning down an entire oil rig in a fit of rage, Panzram was fired. When he found his former boss to discuss the termination, he beat the man so severely that the supervisor barely survived. Panzram was now unemployed, angry, and alone in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language and knew almost nothing about the culture. That's when he saw the boy. An Angolan child, estimated to be around 11 or 12 years old, approached Panzram. Perhaps looking for food, perhaps looking for work. Panzram took the boy to a gravel pit approximately a quarter mile from the main road. Isolated, hidden, no witnesses. The events that occur in that gravel pit represents one of the most disturbing crimes in Panzram's entire catalog of horrors. He assaulted the child. Then, he beat the boy with such savage, relentless violence that the child's skull fractured. Panzram would later describe the scene in his confession with chilling clinical detail, noting the severity of the injuries he inflicted. The boy's body was never recovered. But Panzram wasn't done with Africa yet. Not even close. A few days after the gravel pit incident, Panzram made his way to Lobito Bay, down the coast from Luanda. There, he approached a group of local guides with an offer. "I want to hunt crocodiles," he told them through gestures and broken communication. "I'll pay you to take me into the backwaters." 6 men agreed. They had no reason to suspect anything. Foreign hunters came to Africa all the time looking for exotic game. They had no idea they were the ones being hunted. The men loaded into the canoe with Panzram and began paddling down the river, deeper into the wilderness. The water was dark, thick vegetation lined both banks, and lurking beneath the surface were the very crocodiles Panzram had supposedly come to hunt. Then, without warning, Panzram raised his weapon. 6 shots, 6 bodies. The first guide didn't even have time to turn around before the bullet entered his back. Then the second, then the third. Panzram systematically shot all 6 men in the back as they paddled, their focus on navigation, completely unaware until the shots rang out. But Panzram wasn't taking any chances. As each man fell, he moved closer and fired again. 6 men, 6 families who would never know what happened. 6 bodies that Panzram then methodically pushed into the river, where the crocodiles he'd supposedly come to hunt consumed the evidence. Panzram later wrote about this incident with disturbing pride, noting how the crocodiles devoured their bodies with gusto. He showed no remorse, no guilt. If anything, he seemed to relish the memory. And then he wrote something even more chilling. To someone of average intelligence, ending the lives of 6 at once seems almost impossible. It was very much easier for me to eliminate those 6 men than it was to harm even one of the young boys I ended later. Some of them were only 11 or 12 years old, and they fought back harder. Think about that for a moment. 6 grown men were easier to destroy than children. Not because he had moral qualms, but because children fought harder for their lives. This wasn't just violence. This was systematic extermination carried out by someone who had completely dehumanized every person on Earth, including himself. When Panzram returned to the United States in 1922, Portuguese authorities were already looking for him. He had to carefully slip back into the country, but once home, he resumed his pattern of violence. Between 1922 and 1928, Panzram continued his crimes across the East Coast. He later confessed to ending the lives of 2 more young boys during this period. In July 1922, he beat a boy to death with a rock in Salem, Massachusetts. Later that year, he strangled another boy near New Haven, Connecticut. The Connecticut victim was found in August 1923. A young man estimated to be about 20 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 150 pounds, wearing a striped brown suit with a chauffeur's cap. He had been strangled with a belt drawn tightly around his neck. A handkerchief stuffed with cotton had been tied around his mouth. 2 wounds on his chest, initially thought to be from a weapon, were later determined to be injuries from Panzram's shoes as he held the victim down. Panzram was also arrested for burglary in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he served 6 months. While there, he got involved in a maritime union strike that turned violent. After a gun battle with police, he jumped bail and went on the run again. During this period, Panzram became obsessed with the idea of becoming a professional hitman. He still had the weapon he'd used in the Angola incidents, and in 1922, he had it fitted with a silencer by the Maxim Silent Firearms Company in Hartford, Connecticut. He eagerly tested the device, imagining a lucrative career-ending lives for money. But the silencer didn't work as promised. The weapon still made considerable noise. Panzram was deeply disappointed. "If that heavy caliber pistol and the silencer had only worked as I thought it would," he wrote later, "I would have gone into the business of ending lives on a wholesale scale." The thought is terrifying. An already prolific offender fantasizing about eliminating people for profit, disappointed only by faulty equipment. On August 16, 1928, Carl Panzram was arrested in Washington, D.C., following a string of burglaries. During his interrogation, Panzram voluntarily confessed to ending the lives of 2 boys. Investigators were stunned. Given his extensive criminal record and these confessions, Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, the same prison where his hatred had been forged 2 decades earlier. When Panzram arrived at Leavenworth in early 1929, he immediately told the warden, "I'll end the life of the first man that bothers me." Prison officials decided to give him a job where he could work alone, in the prison laundry, under civilian supervisor Robert Warnke. Warnke was a quiet, well-liked 47-year-old from Cleveland who had worked at Leavenworth for 8 years. There seemed to be no reason for conflict, but Panzram had warned them, and he kept his word. Robert Warnke woke up that morning like he had for thousands of mornings before. He kissed his wife goodbye. He thought about his son, He put on his work clothes and headed to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where he'd worked as a civilian laundry foreman for 8 years. He was a good man, quiet, kind, never harsh with the inmates, never cruel. In a prison full of violence and anger, Robert Warnke was one of the few people who treated the inmates like human beings. But none of that would matter, because Carl Panzram had made a promise when he arrived at Leavenworth. I'll end the life of the first man that bothers me. And in Panzram's twisted mind, Robert Warnke had bothered him. The laundry room was quiet when Warnke arrived that morning. A few inmates were already working at their stations. One of them was Panzram, the prisoner everyone knew was dangerous, the one with the dark eyes and the constant rage simmering just below the surface. Leaning casually against the door was a 4-foot iron bar. It was used as a support for wooden transport crates, heavy, solid, brutal. Panzram had noticed it days earlier, maybe weeks. He'd been thinking about it, planning. Warnke walked to his usual spot and began preparing paperwork for the day's work assignments. His back was to Panzram. He was completely unaware of what was about to happen. Panzram stood up. He walked calmly toward the iron bar. His movements were deliberate, controlled. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated, calculated. He picked up the bar. The weight felt good in his hands. He approached Warnke from behind. What followed after that took maybe 15 seconds. Panzram raised the iron bar and brought it down directly onto Warnke's skull. The sound was sickening. Warnke crumpled, but Panzram didn't stop. He hit him again and again. Evidence sprayed across the walls and floor. Other inmates screamed and backed away in horror. Then Panzram turned on them. "Since I've already harmed one," he shouted, swinging the bar, "I might as well eliminate all of you." Prisoners ran for their lives. The general alarm blared. Dozens of guards with weapons sprinted toward the laundry. When they looked through the barred windows, they saw a scene from a nightmare. The room was destroyed, evidence everywhere. And standing in the center was Carl Panzram, drenched in crimson, still holding the iron bar. Robert Warnke lay motionless behind him. "Let me in." The guards aimed their weapons. "Drop it now." Panzram looked at them. Then something shifted in his eyes. Not remorse, satisfaction. "I just ended Warnke's life," he said calmly. "Let me in." The guards refused until he dropped the bar. He smiled. "Oh, I guess this is my lucky day." He dropped it. Robert Warnke, the foreman who had only tried to do his job, was gone. He left behind a wife and son. Panzram was placed in isolation, but he wasn't worried. He knew exactly where this was heading, and he welcomed it. Before his transfer to Leavenworth, Panzram had met a young prison guard named Henry Lesser in the Washington, D.C. jail. Lesser was just 26 years old. Unlike every other authority figure in Panzram's life, Lesser showed him kindness. When he heard about brutal treatment Panzram endured, Lesser felt genuine sympathy. One day, Lesser slipped Panzram $1 for cigarettes and food. "No one had ever been kind to me in my entire life," Panzram later told Lesser. The two formed an unlikely friendship that continued through letters even after Panzram's transfer. After Panzram ended Warnke's life and was sentenced to death, Lesser provided him with pencils and paper, convincing the condemned man to write his life story. Over several months in 1929 and 1930, Panzram wrote more than 40,000 words, documenting his entire criminal career in shocking detail. He spared nothing. He described his crimes with cold precision. He explained his philosophy of hatred. "In my lifetime, I have taken the lives of 21 human beings," I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed violent crimes against more than 1,000 males of all ages, he began. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me. I don't believe in man, God, nor devil. I hate the whole human race, including myself. He ended with his personal motto: rob 'em all, assault 'em all, and harm 'em all. Fighting for death. When activists and death penalty opponents learned of Panzram's case and attempted to appeal his sentence, Panzram was furious. The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it. He wrote to the Society for the Abolishment of Capital Punishment. He even wrote to President Herbert Hoover. I am sane, and I know what I did. I deserve to be executed. Do not stop it. Panzram wanted to face the consequences, not out of remorse, but because he believed execution was the only fitting end for someone like him. After being convicted, Carl Panzram was moved to death row at Leavenworth. His execution date was set for September 5, 1930. Most condemned prisoners spend their final weeks in prayer or regret. Panzram fought anyone who tried to save him, writing scathing letters demanding they stop interfering. Think about that. A man on death row fighting to make sure he would be executed, not out of remorse, but because he genuinely believed he deserved it, or perhaps because he simply wanted it to end. September 4th, 1930. Panzram's last night alive. Robert Stroud, the famous Birdman of Alcatraz, was also on death row at Leavenworth. He later wrote about Panzram's final hours. All night long that last night he walked the floor of his cell, Stroud recalled, never stopping, just pacing and singing. Guards reported hearing Panzram singing a crude, violent song, something about hatred and death and his own twisted philosophy. He paced back and forth like a caged animal, singing in the darkness. He didn't sleep, didn't pray, didn't show fear or regret. He just waited. The sun hadn't risen when the guards came for Carl Panzram. He stepped out without hesitation. No struggle, no panic. 2 U.S. Marshals escorted him toward the execution chamber. They led him outside to the gallows, 13 steps leading up to a platform. The noose hung from above, swaying in the morning breeze. Panzram looked at it. Then he started walking. He climbed those steps with his teeth clenched, his face set in defiance. No trembling, no hesitation. When he reached the platform, they attempted to place a black hood over his head. But Carl Panzram wasn't going out quietly. He suddenly turned and spat directly in the executioner's face. One final act of contempt. Then he spoke his final words. Words that would be quoted for nearly a century. Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could end the lives of a dozen men while you're fooling around. Even facing the noose, even seconds from death, Carl Panzram was threatening violence. The trapdoor opened. The noose snapped tight. Carl Panzram's neck broke instantly. At 6:30 a.m. on September 5th, 1930, Carl Panzram was declared deceased. He was 39 years old. He had spent nearly half his life in prisons, the other half destroying as many lives as possible. No one claimed Panzram's body, no family, no friends, nobody. Prison staff loaded his corpse into a wheelbarrow and wheeled him to the prison cemetery. They buried him in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no name, just a number, 31,614. That's how Carl Panzram left this world, alone, unmourned, reduced to a number, Exactly as he had predicted. Exactly as he wanted. Henry Lesser kept Panzram's manuscript for 4 decades. Finally, in 1970, 40 years after Panzram's execution, the autobiography was published under the title Killer, a Journal of Murder. The book shocked readers and criminologists. Here was a complete, unfiltered look into the mind of someone who truly hated humanity. Dr. Karl Menninger, the famous psychiatrist, described Panzram as the logical product of the American prison system, a man created by systematic abuse and brutality. Lesser dedicated the rest of his life to prison reform, using Panzram's story as a cautionary tale. In 1980, he donated Panzram's original manuscript to San Diego State University, where it remains today as the Karl Panzram Papers. Karl Panzram confessed to ending 21 lives. That's the official number. But nobody believes that number. Think about it. Panzram operated for nearly 20 years across multiple continents, using over a dozen aliases. He moved constantly, always one step ahead of the law. Authorities confirmed only 5 deaths with absolute certainty. Robert Warnke at Leavenworth, Henry McMahon in Massachusetts, an unidentified young man near New Haven, Warden Minto as an accessory, 1 yacht victim identified from dental records, 5 confirmed, 16 mentioned in his confession but never verified. But what about the ones he didn't confess to? The 10 sailors dumped in Long Island Sound, most never identified. The 6 guides in Angola, fed to crocodiles, no investigation ever conducted. The boy in the gravel pit, never identified, never found. And those are just from his confession. What about crimes Panzram didn't bother documenting? Some criminologists believe the real number could exceed 100 victims. He claimed to have assaulted over 1,000 people. If even 10% of those assaults turned deadly, that's 100 victims. He traveled constantly: Minnesota, Oregon, Washington, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Angola, and countless places between. He had nearly 2 decades of freedom between reform school and his final arrest. Bodies dumped in oceans, remains fed to animals, victims in remote locations. In the 1910s and 1920s, before modern forensics, people could simply vanish, and Panzram knew it. When Killer, a Journal of Murder was published in 1970, it shocked the nation again. Here was a complete confession from one of history's most dangerous criminals. No lawyer editing his words, just raw, brutal honesty. Dr. Menninger believed Panzram had been created by the very institutions designed to reform him. The abuse at reform school, the severe mistreatment at Leavenworth, the systematic brutality of early 20th century prisons had taken a troubled boy and manufactured a monster. But even Menninger admitted Panzram was an extreme case. Most people subjected to similar abuse didn't become mass offenders. There was something in Panzram himself that made him particularly susceptible. Or perhaps, as Panzram believed, he was simply born wrong. Henry Lesser dedicated his life to prison reform. He would tell audiences, 1 act of kindness, $1 for cigarettes, and Karl Panzram was willing to confess everything. Imagine what might have happened if someone had shown him kindness when he was 12. But Lesser never made excuses for what Panzram did. He understood that Panzram made choices, horrible, evil choices, that nothing could justify. Researchers still study the Karl Panzram papers at San Diego State University, trying to understand how someone becomes so consumed by hatred that they declare war on the entire human race. They're still looking for answers. If you visit Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary today, you can find the prison cemetery. row after row of simple markers, most bearing only numbers. Somewhere in that cemetery is grave number 31,614. No name, no dates, no epitaph. Just a number marking where Carl Panzram's body was buried after nobody claimed it. But his victims deserve to be remembered. Robert Warnke, who left behind a wife and son. The sailors who thought they'd found honest work. The boy in Angola whose name we'll never know. The 6 guides whose families never learned their fate. They all had names. They all had families. They all had futures that Carl Panzram stole from them. And somewhere, perhaps, there are other victims we don't even know about yet. The ocean keeps its secrets. The crocodiles told no tales, and Carl Panzram is gone, taking whatever remained of his dark secrets with him to that unmarked grave. The only thing we know for certain is this: 21 confirmed victims is almost certainly not the whole story. The real number? That died with him. Carl Panzram's story stands as a dark reminder of how cycles of violence can create unimaginable evil. If this story impacted you, please share this video to spread awareness about the devastating effects of systematic abuse and the importance of intervention. Subscribe to stay informed about true crime cases that teach us vital lessons about society and safety. Together, we can work toward a world where fewer Carl Panzrams are created. Now let's move on to the 4th disturbing true crime story. Imagine opening your door to a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, struggling with books. He seems helpless, charming, and polite. You help him to his car. That simple act of kindness becomes your final moment alive. This wasn't fiction. This was the reality for dozens of young women who encountered Theodore Robert Bundy, one of America's most notorious criminals. January 1978. Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house. It's 3 a.m. Students are asleep, dreaming of their futures. Within 15 minutes, 4 women are brutally attacked. 2 will never wake up. The attacker moves through the house like a shadow, silent and calculated. When police arrive, they find a scene so horrific that seasoned officers step outside to compose themselves. What kind of person could do this? The answer would shock the nation. A law student, a crisis hotline volunteer, a man who worked alongside the daughter of a prominent Seattle attorney, a man who seemed destined for success. Ted Bundy confessed to taking the lives of 30 young women. 30 families were destroyed, 30 futures erased. But investigators believe the real number could be over 100. Think about that. 100 daughters, sisters, friends, gone. And for years, nobody suspected the clean-cut, articulate young man who seemed so normal, so trustworthy. What made Bundy different from other criminals wasn't just the number of his crimes, it was how he did it. He was educated, charming, and handsome. He volunteered at a crisis center, helping people in distress. He was studying law. He had relationships, friends, a seemingly normal life. This wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. This was evil wearing a 3-piece suit, carrying a briefcase, smiling at you in broad daylight. Bundy had a system, refined through practice. He would fake injuries, a broken arm, a leg in a cast. He'd drop books, struggle with objects, ask for help loading things into his car. His targets were always the same. Young women with long dark hair parted in the middle. They reminded him of someone who broke his heart, someone who made him feel worthless, and he made dozens of innocent women pay that price. But here's what kept investigators awake at night. Bundy could be anywhere. He moved across state lines, attacked in different jurisdictions, changed his patterns just enough to avoid detection. Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Florida. The bodies appeared across the entire western United States and beyond. Police departments didn't communicate well in the 1970s. What seemed like isolated cases in different states was actually one person, moving like a ghost across America. How does someone become this? Was Theodore Bundy born evil, or did something create the monster? How did he evade police for so long despite being arrested multiple times? What finally brought him down? How many victims are still unknown, their families never getting closure? And perhaps most disturbing, how many people like Ted Bundy walk among us today, hiding behind charming smiles and normal appearances? The story you're about to hear will answer these questions. But be warned, once you understand how Ted Bundy operated, you'll never look at strangers the same way again. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. But Ted Bundy's life began with a lie that would poison everything that followed, a deception that would shape his psychology in profound and disturbing ways. The woman he called sister was actually his mother. The people he called parents were actually his grandparents. Eleanor Louise Cowell, his biological mother, was unmarried when she had Ted, something considered deeply shameful in 1946 America. To avoid scandal and protect the family's reputation, her parents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, raised Ted as their own son, and Eleanor became his sister in the household. Ted didn't discover this truth until his teenage years, some accounts suggesting he was 15 when he found his birth certificate. Imagine that moment. Learning your entire childhood was built on deception. Your sister is your mother. Your parents are your grandparents. Your father? Unknown. Some reports suggested his biological father might have been a violent man named Lloyd Marshall. Other accounts hinted at something even darker, that Ted's father might have been someone inappropriate within the family, possibly even Eleanor's own father, Samuel Cowell. Ted would never know for certain, and that uncertainty, that void where his identity should be, festered inside him like an infection. Samuel Cowell, Ted's grandfather, was by all accounts a violent, harsh man. He was known to be intolerant and physically aggressive. He reportedly mistreated animals, pushed people downstairs, and terrorized the household. Young Ted witnessed this behavior, absorbed it, learned from it. Some psychologists would later theorize that Ted identified with his grandfather, seeing him as a strong male figure, while simultaneously recognizing the violence and cruelty that defined him. The Philadelphia years and moving west. In 1950, when Ted was 4 years old, Eleanor moved with him to Tacoma, Washington, desperate to escape her father's household and start fresh away from the shame of her past. She changed their surnames to Nelson, attempting to create a new identity. A year later, in 1951, she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook and military veteran. Ted took his stepfather's name, officially becoming Theodore Robert Bundy. By all accounts, Johnny Bundy tried to be a good father. He was kind, steady, hardworking. He included Ted in family activities, tried to bond with him, treated him as his own son. But Ted rejected him completely and consistently. He viewed Johnny as beneath him intellectually, someone without sophistication or education, someone common and ordinary. Ted, even as a child, saw himself as special, destined for greater things than his stepfather could possibly understand. This rejection of a stable father figure This refusal to accept genuine love and guidance became another piece of the puzzle that was Ted Bundy's psychology. Young Ted seemed normal on the surface, at least to casual observers. He was intelligent, scoring well on IQ tests when he bothered to try. He did well in school when he applied himself, showing particular aptitude for politics and psychology. He was polite to adults, well-spoken, seemingly well-adjusted. But there were signs, dark indicators that something was profoundly wrong beneath the surface. Neighbors later recalled disturbing incidents that took on new meaning after Ted's arrest. One family member, his aunt, woke up surrounded by kitchen knives, carefully arranged around her body while she slept, placed in a pattern. The person who placed them there, standing at the bedside and smiling down at her, 3-year-old Teddy Bundy. When confronted, he just smiled. The awakening of dark desires. As a teenager, Ted became a sophisticated and prolific thief. He shoplifted constantly, not out of financial need, but purely for the thrill of it, the rush of taking something without permission. He stole ski equipment worth hundreds of dollars, electronics, clothing, anything he wanted. He was never caught, never punished, and that sense of getting away with it, of being smarter than everyone around him, fed something dangerous inside him. It confirmed his belief that rules didn't apply to him, that he was above the normal constraints of society. As a teenager, Ted became exposed to violent media that shaped his worldview in troubling ways. He began consuming content that normalized harmful behavior. By his own later admission in interviews with investigators and psychologists, these materials influenced his thoughts significantly and became a preoccupation. During this period, Ted also developed concerning behavioral patterns. He would observe neighborhoods and study people's routines, learning about security weaknesses in residential areas. He was preparing for future actions he didn't yet fully understand himself. These early warning signs went unnoticed by those around him. In 1967, Ted enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle, initially studying Chinese. There, he met Stephanie Brooks, a beautiful, sophisticated woman from a wealthy California family. She was everything Ted wanted to be and everything he felt he wasn't. Confident, secure, from old money, socially connected. He fell completely, obsessively in love with her. She represented the life he craved, the status he desired, the acceptance he needed. For a brief time, they dated, and Ted believed he had finally found what he was looking for. But Stephanie saw through Ted's carefully constructed image. She saw someone directionless, immature, lacking real purpose or drive. She saw someone playing at being sophisticated rather than actually being sophisticated. In 1968, she ended the relationship, delivering words that would echo in Ted's mind for years. She told him he had no real prospects, no future, nothing to offer someone like her. Those words destroyed something fundamental in Ted Bundy. Years later, in interviews, he would say that Stephanie made him feel worthless, inferior, inadequate, feelings that connected directly to the shame of his illegitimate birth and his rejection of his stepfather. Look closely at Ted's victims throughout his offense spree. Every single one had long, dark hair parted in the middle, just like Stephanie Brooks. Their facial features often resembled hers. They were college students, just like she had been. He spent years making women who looked like her pay the ultimate price for his rejection, for his feelings of inadequacy, for the shame he carried. After the breakup with Stephanie, Ted dropped out of school and disappeared for several years. drifting through various menial jobs, spiraling into depression and rage. But around 1969, something changed dramatically. Ted Bundy decided to transform himself, to become the man Stephanie had wanted. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time taking his studies seriously and excelling. He became active in Republican Party politics, working on campaigns, making connections with influential people. He volunteered at Seattle's crisis hotline, where he worked night shifts alongside Ann Rule, a former police officer who was beginning her career as a true offense writer. Ann considered Ted a trusted friend, someone she could count on, someone with genuine empathy. She had no idea who he really was. In 1973, Ted was accepted to law school at the University of Utah. He was finally becoming the successful person he had always believed he should be. And then, in a calculated move that demonstrated his manipulative nature, he reconnected with Stephanie Brooks. He had transformed himself, confident, educated, with prospects. She was impressed, and they briefly rekindled their relationship. Then, once he felt he had won her back, Ted abruptly ended the relationship without explanation, abandoning her just as she had abandoned him. It was revenge, pure and simple. He had proven to himself that he could win her, and then he discarded her. But it wasn't enough. The rage and shame still burned inside him. In 1972, Ted met Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother working as a secretary. They began a relationship that would last years, even during the period when he was actively harming others. Elizabeth, who later wrote a book about her relationship with Ted, described him as attentive, loving, and normal. They talked about marriage, about a future together. She had no idea what he was doing when he wasn't with her. By all appearances, Ted was becoming successful and stable. He was accepted to law school. He was dating a wonderful woman who loved him. He was trusted and respected in his community, and he was ready to begin his true work. On January 4th, 1974 in Seattle, Ted Bundy entered the basement bedroom of 18-year-old Joni Lenz, a student at the University of Washington, while she slept. He violently attacked her with a metal rod torn from her bed frame, causing severe internal injuries and leaving her in a coma. The attack was savage, frenzied, inappropriate in nature. Miraculously, against all odds, Joni survived, though she suffered permanent physical and neurological damage. She remembered nothing of the attack, her mind protecting her from the trauma. But Ted Bundy had finally crossed the line from fantasy to action, and he discovered something terrifying. He liked it. The violence, the complete control, the godlike power over life itself. It satisfied something deep inside him, something that had been building for years. The gratification he derived from violence was intoxicating. 1 month later, he would cross the next line, the line from which there was no return. This time, his victim wouldn't survive. February 1st, 1974. Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old psychology major at the University of Washington, vanished from her basement bedroom. When her roommates discovered she was missing, they found something deeply disturbing. Her bed was carefully made, almost obsessively so, but bloodstains on her pillow and nightgown told a different story. A nightgown hanging in her closet was covered in blood. Someone had carefully cleaned the scene, trying to buy time before the disappearance was discovered. Her skull would be found exactly 1 year later on Taylor Mountain, along with the remains of other victims, all placed carefully in a remote area Ted would later call his graveyard. Over the next 6 months, young women began disappearing throughout Washington and Oregon at an alarming rate. March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, 19, vanished from Evergreen State College while walking to a campus concert. April 17th, Susan Rancourt, 18, disappeared from Central Washington State College after leaving an evening advisors meeting. May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, went missing from Oregon State University. June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington. June 11th, Jorgen Hawkins, 18, vanished from behind her sorority house at the University of Washington. Witnesses heard a scream around 1 a.m., then nothing but silence. These weren't random attacks by some disorganized offender. Ted selected his victims with great care. They were intelligent, attractive young women, usually students with bright futures ahead of them. They were daughters loved by their families, friends cherished by their communities. They had dreams, ambitions, people who cared about them. And Ted took all of that away in moments, satisfying his own twisted needs. July 14th, 1974, remains one of the most brazen offenses in American history. Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular beach near Seattle, was packed with thousands of people enjoying the beautiful summer weather. Families played in the water, couples sunbathed on the beach, young women read books and listened to music. It was a perfect Sunday afternoon. In broad daylight, surrounded by potential witnesses, Ted Bundy approached multiple young women, wearing a fake cast on his arm and introducing himself as Ted. He asked for help loading a sailboat onto his car parked nearby. Several women declined, sensing something wrong, trusting their instincts even though they couldn't articulate why. 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott was seen leaving with Ted around 12:30 p.m. Multiple witnesses watched her walk away with the handsome young man. At approximately 4 p.m., 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslund also disappeared with him from the same beach. Multiple witnesses saw the handsome young man with the arm in a sling throughout the day. They even heard his name, Ted. They described his vehicle, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. They described his appearance, attractive, clean-cut, well-spoken, polite. Police finally had a name, a detailed description, a vehicle type. But incredibly, it still wasn't enough to identify him immediately. The remains of both women were found months later, on September 7th, 1974, in a heavily wooded area near Issaquah, miles from the park. But something else was found with them. The remains of an unidentified third victim, never named, never identified. How many others were there? Unknown and unidentified, taken and disposed of without anyone ever knowing. In fall 1974, Ted Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. The disappearances in Washington slowed dramatically, then stopped. Police in Washington, still investigating the cases, hoped the perpetrator had passed away, moved away, or been imprisoned for another offense. In Utah, however, the nightmare began again with renewed intensity. October 2nd, 1974. Nancy Wilcox, 16, vanished in Holiday, Utah. Her body has never been found. October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, 17, disappeared in Midvale, Utah. Her body was found 9 days later in a canyon, showing evidence of the horrific nature of her final hours. Laura Ann Amy, 17, went missing from a Halloween party on October 31st in Lehi, Utah. Her remains were discovered on Thanksgiving Day in American Fork Canyon. November 8th, Carol Duranch, 18, survived an attempted abduction in Murray, Utah, when a man impersonating a police officer tried to handcuff her and force her into his car. She fought back, escaped, and her testimony would later prove crucial in finally convicting Ted Bundy. Ted's pattern was evolving rapidly. He was attacking more frequently, getting bolder, taking greater risks. The initial thrill was fading, requiring more frequent violence to achieve the same satisfaction. In Colorado, 4 more women disappeared between January and April 1975. Corinne Eileen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Lynn Oliverson, and Lynette Dawn Culver. The jurisdictions still didn't communicate effectively. Each police department thought they had 1 or 2 isolated tragic cases. Nobody realized they were all tracking the same predator. Detective Bob Keppel of the King County Sheriff's Office in Washington began noticing disturbing patterns in early 1974. Young women, all with similar physical appearance, all college students or young professionals, disappearing from public places in similar circumstances. The Lake Sammamish witnesses gave police their first significant break. A name, Ted, a detailed physical description, and a vehicle type, Volkswagen Beetle. These were concrete leads, something to work with finally. Seattle authorities released composite sketches of Ted to the public in July 1974. The sketches were circulated widely across newspapers, television stations, and public bulletin boards. And this is where the case becomes truly disturbing. Multiple people who knew Ted Bundy, including his girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, his friend and co-worker Ann Rule, and even a former psychology professor, called police independently to suggest that Ted Bundy might be worth investigating. His name appeared in police files multiple times. But Ted seemed so normal, so educated, so helpful and charming. How could this law student, this crisis hotline volunteer, this politically active young professional be a dangerous offender? The idea seemed absurd to investigators, and so they moved on to other suspects. Elizabeth Klopfer, in particular, struggled with her suspicions. She loved Ted, believed in him, wanted to marry him, but the timing of the disappearances, his late-night absences, items she found in his apartment, crutches, plaster of Paris for making casts, all disturbed her deeply. She called the police multiple times, but each time, nothing came of it. Ted was questioned briefly and dismissed. He was too normal, too educated, too charming to be an offender. In Utah, Detective Jerry Thompson of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office was investigating the disappearances with growing alarm. When Carol Duranch came forward with her incredible escape story, describing in detail how a man impersonating a police officer had shown her a badge, told her someone tried to break into her car, convinced her to get into his vehicle, then tried to handcuff her and force her into submission before she fought back and escaped. Thompson knew they were dealing with something extremely serious and dangerous. The case heated up dramatically on August 16, 1975. Around 2:30 a.m., Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward was patrolling a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah, when he noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through the area with its headlights off, clearly trying to avoid detection. When Hayward tried to stop the vehicle, it suddenly sped up, running stop signs and traffic signals before finally pulling over. The driver? Theodore Robert Bundy. In the car, Hayward found disturbing items that made his blood run cold. A ski mask, handcuffs, an ice pick, rope, wire, strips of torn sheets, and other tools that clearly weren't ordinary possessions. Ted claimed they were things he found in a dumpster, that he collected random items. He was arrested initially for evading police and possession of burglary tools. But Hayward knew something much darker was happening. Detective Thompson began connecting dots that others had missed. The Volkswagen Beetle. The handcuffs matching those used in Carol Duranche's attempted abduction. Her detailed description of her attacker. Thompson showed Duranche a photo lineup containing 6 photographs. She carefully studied each one, then without hesitation identified photograph number 4, Ted Bundy. For the first time, police had a suspect with physical evidence, an eyewitness, and a name that kept appearing in multiple investigations. Meanwhile, investigators in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado finally began comparing notes in late 1975. The same type of vehicle appearing in witness statements, similar victim profiles across states, overlapping timelines that suggested one person traveling between states. The evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion. They were hunting the same person, and they finally had him in custody in Utah. In February 1976, Ted Bundy stood trial for the attempted abduction of Carol Duranche. Despite having a strong case, prosecutors worried. Bundy was articulate, intelligent, charming. He represented himself in court, cross-examining witnesses, making legal arguments. Some jurors seemed almost mesmerized by him, but the evidence was too strong. On March 1, 1976, Ted Bundy was found guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While awaiting sentencing in the Duranche case, he was charged with the harm done to Corinne Campbell in Colorado. On June 7, 1977, while at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a hearing in the Campbell case, Bundy asked to visit the courthouse library to conduct research. Given minimal supervision because of his status as a former law student, Ted jumped from a second-story window and escaped. He was free for 6 days. The entire region was on high alert. Finally, on June 13th, police spotted Ted driving a stolen car. He was captured and returned to custody. Security was tightened. But Ted wasn't finished. Ted had been studying the jail's layout for months. He discovered that the cell above his was empty. Over time, he sawed a hole in his cell ceiling, losing weight so he could squeeze through. On December 30th, 1977, guards discovered Ted was gone. He had escaped through the ceiling into the empty cell above and out through the building. He was already hundreds of miles away. This time, Ted Bundy fled to Florida. He had just entered the deadliest phase of his offenses. January 15th, 1978, around 3 a.m. Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee through an unlocked rear door. In approximately 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women. Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, lost their lives. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner survived, though both suffered severe injuries. The attack was savage, frenzied, different from his earlier offenses. This wasn't the calculating predator carefully selecting victims. This was someone spiraling, losing control. A witness saw a man leaving the sorority house around 3:15 a.m., carrying a wooden club, wearing a dark knit cap. Blocks away, about 30 minutes later, Ted attacked another student, Cheryl Thomas, in her apartment. She survived but suffered permanent hearing loss and other injuries. On February 9th, 1978, Ted Bundy took his final victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. She was abducted from her middle school in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found 8 weeks later in a state park. This offense was different from all the others. Kimberly was so young, taken in broad daylight from a school. Ted was completely unraveling. On February 15th, 1978, Pensacola police officer David Lee noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving erratically. When he ran the plates, they came back stolen. He pulled the vehicle over. The driver showed a stolen license. When Officer Lee told him he was under arrest, the driver struggled violently. Finally subdued, the man's wallet revealed his true identity: Theodore Robert Bundy, escaped prisoner and wanted offender. The manhunt that had stretched across multiple states and years was finally over. Ted Bundy would never be free again. Ted Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega attacks began in June 1979 in Miami. It was one of the first televised trials in American history, and millions watched the proceedings. Ted, acting as his own attorney with advisory counsel, was articulate and confident. He seemed to view the trial as a performance, charming spectators, engaging the media. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched Ted's teeth, a revolutionary forensic breakthrough at the time. Witnesses placed him at the scene. Physical evidence connected him to the offenses. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced Bundy to the ultimate penalty. In a bizarre moment, the judge told Ted, "You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself." In January 1980, Ted faced trial for the abduction and harm done to Kimberly Leach. This case was different. The victim was a child, making it even more horrific. Witnesses had seen Ted near Kimberly's school. Forensic evidence placed him with her. Once again, the jury found him guilty. Once again, he received the ultimate sentence. Ted Bundy would spend the next 9 years on the row awaiting his fate, exhausting every appeal, giving interviews, confessing to offenses as his execution date approached, always trying to maintain control. While awaiting his fate, Ted Bundy became a celebrity. He gave interviews, wrote letters, corresponded with criminologists and investigators. He was charming, intelligent, articulate, everything that made him dangerous. He used his offenses to study himself, offering insights into criminal psychology while carefully maintaining a level of mystique. Detective Bob Keppel from Washington visited Ted while he awaited his fate. For years, Ted had refused to confess to the Washington cases, though everyone knew he was responsible. In the days before his final day, Ted finally began confessing, using the information as leverage, trying to delay what was coming. He confessed to 30 incidents, but suggested there were many more. He described his offenses clinically, in the third person, as if discussing someone else. He detailed how he selected victims, how he gained their trust, what he did to them. Some investigators believed he was still withholding information about other victims, taking those secrets to his grave. As the date of his sentence approached, Ted's legal team exhausted every possible appeal. Meanwhile, crowds gathered outside Florida State Prison. Some held signs supporting the sentence being carried out. Others protested capital punishment. Inside, Ted Bundy spent his final hours confessing to more offenses, giving details about victims, always trying to maintain control until the very end. At 7:16 a.m. on January 24th, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy's sentence was carried out in Florida's execution chamber. He was 42 years old. His final words were apologies to the families of his victims, words that rang hollow after years of manipulation and deceit. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted in cheers. Fireworks were set off. People held signs expressing their feelings about the outcome. The relief was palpable. A monster was finally gone, but the pain he caused remains forever. Ted Bundy confessed to harming 30 young women, but investigators believe the true number could exceed 100. The confirmed victims include Linda Ann Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Each name represents a real person with dreams, family, and a future. Bundy took everything from them. Even today, investigators discover remains that may never be identified. Many families still search for answers about their missing loved ones. The most important lesson is this: dangerous people don't always look dangerous. Bundy was charming, educated, and helpful. He volunteered at crisis centers and studied law. Even close friends never suspected him. We cannot judge someone's danger level by appearance alone. At Lake Sammamish, several women refused Bundy's request for help. Something felt wrong. They trusted their gut and saved their lives. It's okay to say no to strangers. Your safety matters more than being polite. In the 1970s, police couldn't easily share information across states. Today, databases, security cameras, and DNA testing help catch criminals faster and prevent future harm. If you see something suspicious, report it. Witnesses helped capture Bundy. Your awareness could save lives. Stay aware and trust your instincts. Share this video to spread awareness about personal safety. Subscribe for more true crime cases that teach important safety lessons. Together, we can stay vigilant and protect our communities. Let's move on to the fifth disturbing true crime story. Imagine walking through the hills of Pereira, Colombia in November 1997. The air is thick with the smell of sugarcane fields. Then, something catches your eye. A piece of clothing, then bones, then more bones. What investigators discovered next would shake an entire nation to its core. 36 small bodies, all children, all showing signs of unimaginable horror. But this was just the beginning. In April 1999, Colombian police broke down the door of a small apartment in Villavicencio. Inside a wooden box, they found something that would haunt them forever. Dozens of carnival masks, clown faces, animal faces. Each one is carefully labeled with dates and locations. Some had small brown stains, blood. Each mask represented a missing child. The man who collected these masks would soon confess to something that seemed impossible. He claimed he had taken the lives of over 140 young boys across Colombia. But investigators believed the real number was much higher. Perhaps 300. Maybe even 400 innocent children. Who was this monster? His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos. The media would call him many names. La Bestia, the Beast, El Cura, the Priest, Tribalin, Goofy. But behind these names was a man who carried out one of the most disturbing crime sprees in modern history. For 7 years, between 1992 and 1999, Garavito moved like a ghost across Colombia. He traveled to at least 11 of Colombia's 32 departments. He crossed borders into Ecuador and Venezuela. Everywhere he went, children disappeared. His method was terrifyingly simple. He would dress as a priest, a monk, or a street vendor. He would approach poor children, street vendors, vulnerable boys who had no one watching over them. He promised them work. He offered them money. He said he could help them. The children trusted him. That trust would cost them their lives. What happened next in those remote locations, those hidden wooded areas, those quiet hillsides, was beyond comprehension. The recovered bodies showed evidence of severe harm. Their hands had been bound with nylon cord. The evidence revealed the extreme nature of these crimes. But here is what makes this case even more disturbing. For 5 full years, no one connected these disappearances. No one realized that one man was hunting children across an entire country. The police did not investigate. Families reported their children missing, but nothing happened. Why? Because these were poor children. Street children. Children selling lottery tickets or candy to help their families survive. Children that society had forgotten. And Luis Alfredo Garavito knew this. He specifically targeted these vulnerable boys because he understood that no one would immediately search for them. No one would raise an alarm. By the time anyone noticed, he would already be in another city, wearing another disguise, hunting his next victim. How does someone kill so many children and escape detection for so long? How does a monster hide in plain sight? And most terrifying of all, how many other predators are walking among us right now, wearing friendly masks, waiting for their opportunity? This is the complete story of Luis Alfredo Garavito, from his twisted childhood to his first murder, from the investigation that almost failed to the confession that revealed the true horror, from the controversial trial to his death in prison in 2023. But this is not just a story about one serial killer. This is a story about society's failures, about the children we ignore, about the warning signs we miss, about the systems that protect predators instead of victims. Stay with us as we uncover every detail of this case, because only by understanding how this happened can we prevent it from happening again. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in Geneva, Quindío, Colombia. He was the oldest of 7 brothers. To understand the monster he became, we must first understand the child he was. Colombia in the 1950s and 1960s was a country torn apart by violence. The period known as La Violencia saw members of the Conservative Party and Liberal Party clash in bloody conflicts. Entire families were forced to flee their homes. Garavito's family was one of them. They moved from Geneva to Ceylon in Valle de Cauca when Luis was still young. But the violence outside their home was nothing compared to the violence inside it. During his trial, Garavito described his father as a violent alcoholic and a womanizer. He said his parents fought constantly, throwing words of great caliber at each other. His father physically abused the entire family. Young Luis and his brothers learned to hide whenever their father came home. Garavito claimed his father only interacted with him for work-related purposes and errands. The man would berate him constantly, breaking down any sense of self-worth the boy might have had. But there was worse to come. Garavito testified that he was harmed by neighbors on 2 separate occasions during his youth. He never told his parents because he feared his father's reaction more than he feared his abusers. The trauma went unnoticed. No one helped him. No one saved him. This does not excuse what he would become. Millions of people suffer abuse and never hurt anyone. But it shows us how a human being can be broken, how empathy can be destroyed, how a victim can transform into a predator. At age 16, Luis Alfredo Garavito left home. He drifted from job to job. He worked as a store clerk. He sold prayer cards and religious icons on street corners, which may be where he got the idea to later disguise himself as a priest. He developed a severe alcohol addiction. Those who knew him during this time described him as having a terrible temper. He was unstable, angry, and increasingly disturbed. But what they did not know was far worse. Years later, Garavito would confess that his first offense against a child happened when he was just 15 years old, in 1972, in the municipality of Geneva. He would claim that between 1980 and 1992, before his known crimes, he had already begun harming young boys. The evil was growing inside him, and no one was stopping it. In later interviews, Garavito would tell investigators something chilling. He claimed that one night, while using certain practices, he entered what he called a state of mental disturbance. In this state, he said dark forces influenced him. He said he agreed to serve them. The response, according to Garavito, was simple: instructions to commit violence. Whether this was genuine delusion or a calculated excuse, we may never know. But what happened next was very real. On October 4th, 1992, Luis Alfredo Garavito took his first life. His victim was a 13-year-old boy named Juan Carlos. Garavito had actually attempted to harm someone 3 days earlier, on October 1st. He had found a young boy selling sweets and cigars to passers-by. In what he described as a state of intoxication, he tried to lure the boy to a wooded lot in the Melia Hotel sector in Bolivar. But he was interrupted. Local police beat him, struck him over the head with a weapon, and robbed him of 1,000 pesos, a watch, and a ring. Then they let him go. They had no idea they had just released a killer. 3 days later, Juan Carlos became victim number 1. Luis Garavito developed a terrifyingly effective system. His modus operandi remained consistent throughout his 7-year killing spree. He owned multiple costumes. Sometimes he dressed as a Catholic priest or monk, which is why the media called him El Cura. Other times he appeared as a homeless person or street vendor. The disguises made him forgettable, someone who blended into the background of Colombian street life. He targeted crowded parts of cities during daytime, busy markets, street fairs, places where poor children gathered to sell goods or beg for money. His targets were always the same: boys between the ages of 6 and 16, though most were between 8 and 13. They came from poor families. Many were street children, unattended children of street vendors, or boys who had run away from home. Garavito knew these children would not be immediately missed. He would approach his victims with promises. Sometimes he offered money for easy work. Other times, he promised food or drugs. He made socially believable offers that desperate children could not refuse. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them away from populated areas. He took them to locations that were overgrown with high plants, hidden from view. Remote hillsides, wooded lots, sugarcane fields, places where no one could hear them scream. What happened in those isolated locations was unspeakable. Garavito would bind the children's wrists with nylon cord. Covered bodies showed signs of severe violence. The evidence revealed injuries that demonstrated the extreme brutality of these crimes. Hito would often stay at the scene. He would remain with the bodies and drink himself into unconsciousness beside them. In 1993, in the La Victoria district, he lured 8 boys aged 9 to 11 from a local school to a nearby wooded lot. The victims included Henry Giovanni Garcia, Marco Aurelio Castaño, Juan David Cardenas, and Jaime Orlando Popayan, along with 3 more unidentified children in southeast Bogota. He murdered 2 more children in the Meissen neighborhood before moving on. This was his pattern. He would commit crimes in one location, then move to another city before suspicion could build. He traveled from Tuluá to Pereira to Quimbaya and back to Tuluá. In 1993 alone, his activity ended with the death of 13-year-old Mauricio Monedero Mejia. But still, no one connected the cases. Luis Garavito was not just someone who committed these crimes. He was a collector. In black duffel bags at his sister's house, he stored souvenirs from his kills, bus tickets that showed his travel between cities, items that pinned down times and locations. These would later help investigators tie him to dozens of crimes. He also kept that box of masks. Each carnival mask represented a victim, labeled with dates and location, needed physical reminders of what he had done. Throughout the 19th, still recovering from decades of political violence, in cities filled with poverty and organized crime activity, the 1990s was a nation struggling with multiple crises. The conflict between government forces, paramilitary groups, and armed organizations created an atmosphere of violence and fear. Drug trafficking organizations controlled vast territories. Thousands of people disappeared every year. In this chaos, the disappearance of street children seemed like just another tragic statistic. Colombia did not have a unified database for missing persons. Police departments in different regions had no standardized system to share information about disappearances. This meant Garavito could operate across jurisdictional boundaries without anyone noticing the pattern. Each police department maintained its own records, if any existed at all. A child who went missing in Pereira had no connection in police files to a child who disappeared in Tuluá, even though both cases might have been committed by the same person. The lack of communication between departments created blind spots that Garavito exploited masterfully. Parents of missing children filed reports, but investigations rarely began immediately. There were informal policies that required waiting periods before categorizing children as officially missing, especially children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. The assumption was that these children had simply run away or moved to another city looking for work. This systemic neglect had devastating consequences. By the time authorities began investigating a disappearance, valuable evidence had been lost. Witnesses had forgotten details. Crime scenes had been contaminated or destroyed. And Garavito had already moved to his next hunting ground. The system was designed to fail vulnerable children, and Luis Alfredo Garavito knew it. He understood that society had created tiers of concern. When wealthy children disappeared, massive searches began immediately. News media covered the story. Politicians demanded action. But when poor children vanished, there was silence. Street children in particular existed in a legal and social gray area. Many had no birth certificates. They were not registered in schools. Their families, if they had any, were often too poor or too afraid to push authorities for answers. Garavito recognized this vulnerability and targeted it with cold calculation. In November 1997, someone stumbled upon a mass grave near Pereira. The exact location was a ravine in the western coffee-growing region, an area known for its lush vegetation and remote hillsides. What they found was beyond comprehension. The scene was so disturbing that initial investigators believed it must be the work of a cult. They counted approximately 36 bodies of young boys, all showing similar patterns of harm. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition. Some had been there for years. Others were more recent. The discovery sent shockwaves through Colombian law enforcement. This was not the work of armed groups or drug trafficking organizations. The victims were children. They had been bound. They showed evidence of prolonged suffering. And they had all been left in the same location, carefully hidden from view. For the first time, authorities realized they might be dealing with something unprecedented in Colombian history. Not a political crime. Not gang violence. but a predator who specifically targeted children. Finally, authorities launched a serious investigation. A special task force was assembled, pulling investigators from multiple departments. They began the painstaking work of identifying the victims. Dental records were compared. Missing persons reports were reviewed. Families were contacted to provide DNA samples. But the horrors kept coming. The forensic work presented enormous challenges. Many of the bodies had decomposed to the point where traditional identification methods were impossible. The remote location meant that animals had disturbed some remains. Weather conditions in the tropical climate accelerated decomposition. Forensic experts had to develop new protocols for handling mass graves. They documented every detail. They photographed evidence from multiple angles. They collected soil samples and analyzed insect activity to determine time since passing. What they discovered painted a chilling picture. All of the victims showed remarkably similar characteristics. They were boys between 8 and 13 years old. Their hands had been bound with the same type of nylon cord. Evidence suggested they had all been held in similar ways before their lives ended. But perhaps most disturbing was what forensic experts found at the scene beyond the remains. Empty liquor bottles, always the same brand. The remnants of what appeared to be ritualistic arrangements. And in some cases, items that suggested the perpetrator had spent considerable time at the location after committing his crimes. The forensic teams realized they were not just dealing with someone who took lives quickly. This was someone who stayed with his victims, someone who had a process, someone who was methodical and organized despite being under the influence during his crimes. The investigation was making slow progress when another discovery occurred. On February 6, 1999, outside the town of Palmyra, police discovered the bodies of 2 unclothed children lying next to each other on a hill near a sugarcane field. The location was isolated, far from any homes or businesses. The positioning of the bodies was deliberate. They'd been placed carefully, almost ceremonially. The next day, just meters away, they found another child's body in a similar position. The prosecutor's office immediately recognized the similarities to other cases. The nylon cord, the remote location, the specific targeting of young boys, the evidence of prolonged suffering. Investigators began to notice patterns beyond just the physical evidence. They examined the geography of the crimes. They studied the timeline of disappearances. They analyzed the methods used to lure victims. A profile began to emerge. They were looking for someone who could move easily between cities, someone who blended into crowds, someone who had access to children without raising suspicion, someone who was organized enough to plan these crimes but disturbed enough to carry them out. Investigators determined it was likely one man responsible for all these crimes, but finding him would prove to be extraordinarily difficult. Detective units began employing rudimentary geographic profiling techniques. They spread large paper maps across tables and used colored pins to mark every known crime scene and body discovery location. Patterns emerged from this manual analysis. The crimes followed major transportation corridors. They clustered around bus terminals and marketplaces. They occurred in cities that were experiencing rapid growth and had large populations of street children. The geographic analysis revealed something crucial. The perpetrator was highly mobile. He was traveling by bus, moving from town to town, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern that local police might notice. This mobility explained why no one had connected the cases earlier. Each jurisdiction saw only 1 or 2 disappearances. Without a system to share information nationally, no one realized that dozens of similar crimes were occurring across the country. Investigators also noticed temporal patterns. The crimes would cluster in one region for several weeks or months, then shift to an entirely different part of the country. This suggested someone who was either fleeing from close calls with law enforcement or who had a deliberate strategy of geographic rotation. A break in the case came from an unlikely source and demonstrated how chance can play a crucial role in investigations. After taking the life of a boy near the town of Buga in 1998, Luis Garavito did what he always did. He stayed with the body and consumed alcohol until he lost consciousness. But this time, he fell asleep while smoking. He set himself and the area around him on fire. The flames spread quickly in the dry undergrowth. Garavito woke up surrounded by fire. He had been burned. His clothing was singed, but he managed to flee the scene before anyone arrived. But he left behind crucial evidence. When firefighters extinguished the blaze and discovered the child's remains, they also found items that Garavito had dropped in his panicked escape. Among them were personal items that could be traced. Authorities were able to connect this child's passing to another crime that occurred in 1996 in Tunja. The methods were identical. The evidence at both scenes matched. And suddenly, investigators had a thread to pull. Police began tracing Garavito's movements through hotel registries, bus ticket records, and witness statements. When they questioned his sister in one of their routine inquiries, she made a decision that would crack the case wide open. She turned over several black duffel bags that her brother had left at her house for storage. When investigators opened those bags, they found a treasure trove of evidence. Inside were souvenirs from his crimes. But more importantly, there were practical items that pinned down his movements with incredible precision. Bus tickets, dozens of them, showed travel between cities on specific dates. Hotel receipts placed him in certain locations at certain times. Personal items that clearly did not belong to him, and perhaps most damning, items of clothing that would later be matched to missing children through DNA analysis. The contents of those bags allowed investigators to create a timeline. They could now place Garavito in specific cities when children had disappeared. They could link him to multiple crime scenes across Colombia. The evidence was overwhelming. An arrest warrant was issued, but finding him would prove difficult. Garavito constantly moved between cities, always using false names. He had multiple identification documents. He changed his appearance regularly, and he had become skilled at disappearing into Colombia's transient population of day laborers and street vendors. With an arrest warrant in hand and physical evidence linking him to multiple crimes, law enforcement launched an intensive manhunt. Police distributed descriptions to departments across Colombia. They monitored bus terminals. They showed his photograph to hotel clerks and boarding house operators. But Garavito remained elusive. He had survived for 7 years by staying one step ahead of suspicion. He knew how to blend in. He understood the rhythms of Colombian street life. And he had the advantage of operating in a country where identification checks were sporadic at best. Investigators grew increasingly frustrated. They knew who they were looking for. They had evidence that could convict him, but they could not find him. The breakthrough would come not from brilliant detective work, but from pure chance and the bravery of a child who refused to become another victim. On the evening of April 22nd, 1999, in the city of Villavicencio, Luis Alfredo Garavito was consuming brandy as he walked through a crowded street fair. The atmosphere was festive. Vendors sold food and drinks. Families walked through the market. Children darted between stalls. Garavito spotted a 12-year-old boy named John Ivan Sabogal, who was selling lottery tickets to passers-by. The boy was small for his age, exactly the type of victim Garavito preferred. He was working alone, moving through the crowd, trying to earn money for his family. Garavito approached the boy with practiced ease. He introduced himself using one of his many false identities, Bonifacio Morera Lichcano, claiming to be a local politician. He engaged the boy in conversation, asking about the lottery tickets, complimenting his work ethic. Then, in a moment that the boy would never forget, Garavito's demeanor changed. He produced a sharp implement and used it to threaten the child into silence. Pretending to embrace Sabogal as if they were acquaintances, he began walking the boy away from the crowded market. To any observer, it might have looked like a father and son. But John Ivan was terrified. He could feel the implement pressing against him through their forced embrace. Garavito whispered threats, telling the boy that any attempt to call for help would end badly. Garavito forced the boy into a taxi, continuing to act as if they were traveling together willingly. He gave the driver directions to a remote area on the outskirts of the city. During the ride, he maintained his threatening hold on the boy while making casual conversation with the driver. When they reached a secluded area, Garavito paid the taxi and waited for it to drive away. Then he forced John Ivan to climb a barbed wire fence that led to an isolated hillside. The boy's hands were scratched and bleeding from the fence. His heart was pounding. He knew something terrible was about to happen. On the hillside, hidden from view, Garavito bound the child's wrists with nylon cord. He began acting erratically, alternating between threatening behavior and bizarre attempts at conversation. The boy later reported that Garavito seemed to be arguing with himself, as if multiple personalities were fighting for control. But John Ivan Sabogal was not alone. A homeless, 16-year-old boy had been sleeping in bushes near the hillside. He was awakened by sounds of a struggle. Through the vegetation, he could see an adult man with a younger boy who was clearly in distress. The teenager did not have time to think about the risks. He grabbed rocks and began throwing them at Garavito while shouting at him to let the boy go. Another young person nearby heard the commotion and joined in, throwing stones and yelling. The distraction was enough. John Ivan managed to twist away from Garavito's grasp. His hands were still bound, but he ran. He stumbled down the hillside, calling for help, his voice breaking with terror and relief. Luis Alfredo Garavito fled in the opposite direction. He disappeared into the vegetation, his carefully planned attack disrupted by the courage of street children who understood, perhaps better than anyone, what was at stake. John Ivan reached safety and immediately reported what had happened. He gave detailed descriptions to police: the man's height, his slight limp, the way he spoke, the false name he had used. This time, the description matched something in police files. Within days, authorities spotted a man matching John Ivan's description, trying to lure another child near a different market in Villavicencio. Police approached cautiously. When detained, he was calm, carrying sedatives and a carnival mask. He identified himself as Bonifacio Morera Liscano. Within days, police discovered the real Bonifacio Morera was a politician whose ID had been stolen. When they ran his actual identity, connections emerged. Hotels where children disappeared, bus routes matching crime timelines. They'd captured one of the world's most prolific criminals. Transferred to secure facilities, Garavito faced detective teams from across Colombia. He was polite, cooperative, friendly, never defensive. He seemed curious about the investigation. Psychologists observed his ability to shift personas, submissive with male detectives, assertive with females, constantly calculating which version would be most effective. Investigators found the box of masks, each labeled with dates and locations, some bearing bloodstains, matching child disappearances exactly. Rope in his possession matched crime scene cord perfectly. DNA testing linked clothing to missing children. Most compelling was his rare eye condition requiring specially designed prescription eyeglasses, found at a 1998 crime scene. Irrefutable proof. Dr. Mark Benecke described him as one of the most friendly individuals he'd met, jarring given his crimes. Garavito exhibited classic psychopathy, superficial charm, manipulation, lack of remorse. He genuinely seemed to like children, common among such offenders. He expressed pity for victims, claiming sympathy because he too had been harmed. Psychologists recognized this manipulation. For months, Garavito maintained innocence, but evidence kept mounting. On October 28, 1999, he broke. He confessed to killing 140 young boys across Colombia over 7 years and offered to show burial locations. When investigators followed his detailed maps, they found exactly what he described: children's remains in remote hillsides. DNA analysis and trace evidence confirmed everything. Luis Alfredo Garavito had committed one of history's largest crime series against children. Garavito faced trials spanning 11 departments. Prosecution presented hundreds of witnesses and thousands of documents. He was convicted of 138 counts of child murder, plus aggravated assault and kidnapping. The court sentenced him to 1,853 years, Colombian history's longest sentence. But Colombian law prohibits life sentences. Maximum was 40 years. Due to cooperation, his sentence was reduced to 22 years by 2006. 22 years for 138 confirmed murders, less than 2 months per victim. By 2021, early release became possible. President Iván Duque rejected it. A judge blocked release because Garavito hadn't paid victim compensation, a technicality keeping him imprisoned. Garavito served in maximum security in Valledupar, held in complete isolation. He spent over 2 decades reading religious texts and psychology books. In 2016, when journalist John Sistiaga said, "For killing 200 children, the sentence is light," Garavito responded, "Yes, I agree. For what I did, it is very little." Garavito claimed wanting to enter Congress, become a pastor, and help abused children. Prison psychologists noted this was continued harmful thinking, fantasizing about accessing vulnerable children. His health failed, severe eye cancer causing blindness, leukemia, and tuberculosis. On October 12, 2023, Luis Alfredo Garavito died at 66 from cardiac arrest and multiple illnesses. Victims' families gave varied responses, some relief, some anger, some nothing. Convicted of 138, confessed to 140. Investigators believe the number could reach 300 or 400 victims, making him one of history's most prolific serial killers. Investigators continue discovering mass graves using his maps. The search continues because families deserve answers. The case exposed massive failures. Poor children weren't protected. Society treated them as disposable. Lack of unified database meant patterns went unnoticed. It took discovering 36 bodies before serious investigation. By then, Garavito had operated 5 years. Colombia implemented reforms. Code Garepa mandated immediate investigation of missing children regardless of background. Maximum sentence increased to 60 years. Towns established memorials, playgrounds and children's libraries transforming tragedy into joy. Parks feature sculptures with victims' names. When Garavito died, he took many secrets. We'll never know his crime's full extent or identify all victims. Some families will never receive answers, but we know enough. For 7 years, one man terrorized Colombia, targeting the most vulnerable children. Systemic failures allowed him to operate far longer than possible. At least 138 families lost children to his cruelty, possibly hundreds more. The justice system couldn't impose punishment proportionate to the harm. His death doesn't undo the damage. The children remain gone. The families remain broken. The trauma continues. What we can do is remember. Remember victims as individuals with names, dreams, and stolen futures. Remember systemic failures so we continue fixing them. Remember warning signs to better protect children going forward. Luis Alfredo Garavito is dead, but our commitment to protecting the innocent must live on. The beast of Colombia is gone, but vigilance must remain. If this case disturbed you, remember, predators still walk among us. Subscribe to stay informed about true crime cases that expose the failures we must fix to protect the innocent.